Section 0. A Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Maria Therese. Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers by J. Walker McSpadden. Preface. So much has been written about the great soldiers of the world, that it is a matter of considerable hardihood to attempt to present another volume on the subject in any sense new. But the Great War has not only brought to the center of the stage a new group of martial figures, it has also intensified and revivified our interest in those of a bygone day. The springs of history rise far back. We can the better appreciate our leaders of today and their problems by comparing them with the leaders and problems of yesterday. Waterloo takes on a new aspect when viewed from Vimy Ridge. The present book includes a round dozen of the great soldiers of yesterday and today. The list is about equally divided among British, French, and American leaders, and is confined to the last 2 centuries. Each man selected is typical of a particular time and task. His life story contains a message of definite interest and value. In telling these stories, however, in the limits of brief chapters, we have carefully abstained from the writing of formal biographies. Such a treatment would have resulted merely in a rehash of time-worn data beginning, "He was born," and ending, "He died." The plan of these stories is to give a personal portrait of the man, using the background of his early life, to trace his career up from boyhood through the formative years. Such data serves to explain the great soldier of later years. Every schoolboy knows, for example, what Washington did after he was placed in command of the colonial army. But what he did in the earlier years to deserve this high command is a story not so well known. Yet it is most interesting in itself, and serves to humanize its subject. The stately Washington steps down off his pedestal and shoulders again his surveyor's tripod of boyhood days, while he invites us to take a tramp through the Virginia wilds. The writing, and we hope the reading, of these life stories brings in a special message. We discover that in each instance the famous soldier was not a pet of fortune, but was selected for his high and arduous task because of the training received in his formative years. His peculiar gift of leadership was merely an expression of his indomitable will to forge ahead. He exemplified in his life the Boy Scout motto, "Be prepared." End of Preface.
Section 1 of Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephanie Lee. Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers by J. Walker McSpadden. Washington, Part 1. The Young Surveyor. "Turn your guns around on them! Stop them!" The command was given in peremptory tones to a demoralized group of soldiers. Not waiting for them to carry out his orders, the young officer who gave them leaped from his horse, and with his own hands turned one of the guns upon the advancing foe. Had it been the Argonne Forest, and the year 1918, it would have been a machine gun that the officer manned. But the time was over a century and a half earlier than this, and the weapon a light brass field piece, which after being fired once must be painfully reloaded. Meanwhile the redskins came on. The young officer, whose name has come down to history as George Washington, was trying to stem the tide of defeat. It was the fateful day when old General Braddock of the British Army received his first and fatal lesson in Indian warfare. Says an old Pennsylvania ranger who was also in the fray, "I saw Colonel Washington spring from his panting horse, and seize a brass field piece as if it had been a stick. His look was terrible. He put his right hand on the muzzle, his left hand on the breech. He pulled with this, he pushed with that, and wheeled it round, as if it had been a plaything. It furrowed the ground like a ploughshare. He tore the sheet lead from the touch hole. Then the powder monkey rushed up with the fire, when the cannon went off, making the bark fly from the trees, and many an Indian send up his last yell and bite the dust." Yet this resourceful officer, fighting almost single-handed against certain defeat, was then only a young man a few months past 21. He was displaying the same qualities which were later to make him the commander-in-chief of a revolution. George Washington was a typical example of the born leader. He had received no set military training save that which the stern necessity of frontier life forced upon him. Yet at 19 we find him no less courageous and active when facing the enemy. He had been reared as a farmer boy, with no other intention at first than the successful management of his father's estates in Virginia. But boys in those days had to learn to handle the rifle as readily as the plow, and Washington was no exception to this rule. Born in 1732 (every schoolboy knows the month and day) at Bridges Creek, Virginia, his first home was a plain wooden farmhouse of somewhat primitive pattern, with 4 rooms on the ground floor, and a roomy attic covered by a long sloping roof. But before he was more than able to walk this house burned down, and the family removed to another farm in what was later Stafford County, an attractive knoll across the Rappahannock River from Fredericksburg. When George was 11 years old he lost his father, which threw him to a great extent upon his own resources, so far as outdoor life was concerned, although his education was still the care of his mother, who is pictured as a gentlewoman of the old school, one born to command. To her Washington owed many traits, among them his courtliness. In those days the gentle-bred boys always used very formal language when addressing their elders, and so we find Washington writing to his mother, even after he became of age, beginning his letter with "Honored Madam," and ending "Your dutiful son." After his father's death, George Washington made his home for 4 or 5 years with his brother Augustine, who lived at the old homestead, now rebuilt, at Bridges Creek, and near there he attended school. It was in no sense a remarkable school, being kept by a Mr. Williams, but it was thorough in the fundamentals, the 3 R's, without going in much for the frills. Some of Washington's exercise books are still preserved, showing in a good round hand a series of "Rules of Civility and Decent Behavior in Company and Conversation." Such things sound somewhat priggish today, but in those days they were a necessary part of one's education. Washington was probably neither better nor worse than the run of Virginia boys, of gentle stock in those days, just a good-natured, fun-loving youngster, not especially bright as a scholar, but known as a plodder. One of his early playmates was Richard Henry Lee, who also grew up to be a famous Virginian, and between the two some droll schoolboy letters passed. Washington was to be, like his father, a Virginia planter, and this may have had something to do with the sort of education he received, which was not very extensive. But along with his early training for farm life, there were many echoes of the military, which must have had a lasting influence on the growing lad. His brother, Lawrence, had been a soldier in His Majesty's service, and his stories of campaign life so fired George's imagination that he was for throwing his books away at 15 and going into the Navy. He was too young for the army, but Lawrence, who rather encouraged him, told him that he could get him a berth as midshipman. It is related that the young middy's luggage was actually on board a British man-of-war anchored in the Potomac when Madam Washington, who all along had been reluctant to give her consent, now withdrew it altogether, and the dutiful son was saved from the Navy for a larger arena. The boy was then just turned 15, and seems to have rebelled from the humdrum life of the plantation. He was at the restless age, and his naturally adventurous disposition sought a more active outlet. This proved to be surveying, a profession then greatly in demand. There were great tracts of wilderness in Virginia still inhabited by Indians and infested by wild animals which had never heard the sound of the woodman's axe. These tracts had been included in grants from the king, but their boundaries had never been exactly determined. To make such surveys was a task requiring both skill and courage. Washington was naturally an exact and painstaking boy. He now applied himself to geometry and trigonometry, and at the ripe age of 16 was ready to sling his somewhat crude surveyor's instruments across his shoulder and subdue the wilderness. It promised excitement and adventure, and the work was well paid. Washington was even then a strapping big fellow, tall and muscular, and nearly 6 feet in height. He afterwards exceeded this height, but at 16 there were naturally some hollows which remained to be filled out. He is described as having a well-shaped, active figure, symmetrical except for the unusual length of his arms, indicating great strength. His light brown hair was drawn back from a broad forehead, and grayish-blue eyes looked happily and perhaps soberly on the pleasant Virginia hills and valleys. His face was open and manly, set off by a square, massive jaw, and a general expression of calmness and strength. Fair and florid, big and strong, he was, take him for all in all, as fine a specimen of his race as could be found in the English colonies. It was at this turning point in his career that Washington was fortunate in finding a friend and protector in Lord Fairfax, whose daughter was the wife of Lawrence Washington. This distinguished old veteran, a long-time friend of the Washington family, took a particular fancy to the young man. They hunted the fox together, and hunted him hard. In those days fox hunting was no kid glove and pink tea affair. It was one of many perilous outdoor sports that frontier Virginia could afford, and as they hunted the old English nobleman had opportunity to learn what sort of stuff this young Virginian was made of. He saw that there was a union of sturdy qualities upon which he could rely. Lord Fairfax then owned by Kingly Grant a vast estate stretching across the Blue Ridge into the untrodden wilderness. Until the estate was properly surveyed, it would be subject to endless lawsuits. We can imagine the following conversation on one of their helter-skelter rides together. "What are you studying now, George?" "Mathematics, sir." "Humph! Like it?" "In part, but some of it is stiff." "What are you going to do with it?" "Well, sir," hesitated George, "since my mother objects to me going into the Navy, I thought I would turn my hand at surveying. There's lots to be done around here." "The very thing! I think I could use you myself. When you are ready let me know, and I'll send you over the hill yonder to mark out where Fairfax starts, and where he ends. My cousin George will go with you." So in some such fashion it was arranged, and in the spring of 1748 George Fairfax and George Washington set forth on their adventures. The Virginia mountains were just budding forth in the freshness of spring when they started out by way of Ashby's Gap, in the Blue Ridge, entering the Valley of Virginia. Thence they worked through the Shenandoah region, crossing the swollen Potomac and surveying the hilly country of what is now Frederick County. It was a rough and hazardous trip lasting over a month, but one that left them fit and seasoned woodsmen. They had learned what it was to shift for themselves, to defend themselves against prowling beasts in an untrodden wilderness, to swim swollen currents, to be wet and cold and hungry, to come suddenly upon a war party of Indians who would not have scrupled to kill them had the savages known that these two youths were plotting and dividing up the hunting ground which they claimed as their own. That all these things were a part of their experience we note from jottings made briefly but methodically by Washington in his diary of the trip. As to the survey itself, a Virginia title attorney remarked, many years afterward, that in clearing up old titles the lines surveyed by Washington were more reliable than any others of their day. Lord Fairfax was so pleased with its results that he procured for his protégé an appointment as public surveyor. It was his induction into 3 years of hard frontier life which was the finest possible schooling to him for his later career as a soldier. We find him writing to a friend: "Since you received my letter of October last, I have not slept above 3 or 4 nights in a bed, but after walking a good deal all the day I have lain down before the fire upon a little hay, straw, fodder, or a bear skin, whichever was to be had, with man, wife, and children, like dogs and cats, and happy is he who gets the berth nearest the fire. Nothing would make it pass off tolerably but a good reward. A doubloon is my constant gain every day that the weather will permit of me going out, and sometimes 6 pistoles." This would indicate that he was a thrifty lad, honestly pleased with honest earnings, and no mere adventurer. About this time a company was formed, called the Ohio Company, for the purpose of opening a trade route through northern Virginia and Maryland. George Washington's 2 elder brothers, Lawrence and Augustine, were interested in the enterprise, and they naturally called in their young surveyor brother to the consultation. The project sounded fascinating, but presented many elements of danger. The French were becoming more and more active, and making warlike preparations to seize and hold all the western frontier. In order to develop and hold this land against the French and their Indian allies, it was necessary to place the work in the hands of a military leader. George Washington was at this time only 19 years old, but fully grown, a man of powerful physique, hardened and seasoned by his outdoor life. Despite his youth and lack of military experience, the Ohio Company secured for him the appointment of adjutant general of this district. Washington at once placed himself under several military officers of his acquaintance, among them a Major Muse, and soon acquired at least the rudiments of warfare, the manual of arms. The broader school of tactics he was to acquire for himself in the field of experience. An interruption to his military career came in the illness of his brother Lawrence. A voyage to the West Indies was determined upon for the invalid, and George accompanied him. On the young man's first sea voyage, and of which he has left us entertaining glimpses in his ever faithful diary, but after a winter in the South Seas, Lawrence grew worse and was brought home to die. George, though only 20, was made one of the executors to the estate, Mount Vernon, which became henceforth his home. Shortly afterward we find George Washington given still higher office, but one which entailed heavy responsibilities. The newly appointed governor of the state, Robert Dinwiddie, grew uneasy at the constant reports of alliances between the French and the Indians, determined to send a commissioner to the French commander to ask by what right he was building forts in English dominions, and also to treat with the Indians in the way of counter-proposals against the French. It was a hazardous mission, and one which also involved tact, diplomacy, and a first-hand knowledge of the wilderness. But we are not much surprised to find Washington, at 21, given the commission of major and sent on this undertaking. Leaving Williamsburg with a little company of 6, he set out on a cross-country trip by horseback, of more than 1,000 miles. The details of this adventurous journey makes interesting reading, but cannot find place in this necessarily brief story. They reached an Indian village near where the city of Pittsburgh now stands, then turned south to the junction of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, where dwelt a friendly tribe of Indians. Thence they went to Fort Le Boeuf, where the French commander received the Virginia major politely, entertained him, but tried at the same time to win his Indian friends away from him. End of Washington, Part 1. Section 2 of Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephanie Lee. Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers, by J. Walker McSpadden. Washington, Part 2. The return journey was terrible. The horses had become so weak that they were useless except as light pack animals. The little party struggled along on foot. Washington with one companion went on ahead. It was the dead of winter, but when they reached the Ohio River, they found that instead of its being frozen solid as they had hoped, it was a turbulent mass of tossing cakes of ice. "There was no way of getting over," writes Washington in his journal, "but on a raft which we set about with but one poor hatchet, and finished just after sunsetting. This was a whole day's work. We next got it launched, then went on board of it and set off. But before we were halfway over, we were jammed in the ice in such a manner that we expected every moment our raft to sink, and ourselves to perish. I put out my setting pole to try to stop the raft, that the ice might pass by, when the rapidity of the stream threw it with so much violence against the pole that it jerked me out into 10 feet of water, but I fortunately saved myself by catching hold of one of the raft logs. Notwithstanding all our efforts, we could not get to either shore, but were obliged, as we were near an island, to quit our raft and make to it. The cold was so extremely severe that Mr. Gist had all his fingers and some of his toes frozen, and the water was shut up so hard that we found no difficulty in getting off the island on the ice in the morning, and went to Mr. Fraser's. Here they succeeded in procuring horses. In a few days more Major Washington handed in his report to the governor at Williamsburg. This report stirred the Virginia House of Burgesses to action. It showed that the whole western frontier was imperiled. One of Washington's recommendations, that a fort be built at the fork of the Ohio, was put into effect at once, and a Captain Trent was sent out with some woodsmen to begin its construction. But before the fort was completed, a force of French descended upon it and captured it. Near its site they themselves built a larger one, which they called Fort Duquesne, the site of the later city of Pittsburgh. This action on the part of the French was equivalent to a declaration of war. It was really the beginning of the 7 Years' War between England and France for the control of America, a drama in which Washington was to have no little part. When news of the French move reached the governor, he sent Washington, with the rank of lieutenant colonel and a small armed force, against the invaders. The men were mostly half-trained militia whom Washington had been drilling for some such emergency. They were raw soldiers, but hardy fellows, who thoroughly believed in their young commander. He himself, although but 22, was a seasoned campaigner of the wilderness. Now he was essaying his first trial as a soldier. His men marched to a point about halfway to Fort Duquesne, blazing a road for other troops to follow, and constructing a fort to serve as a base of supplies. There he sent out scouts to reconnoiter. They reported an advancing party of French, who were ready to attack any English whom they might encounter. Washington did not wait for them to attack. He decided to attack first. Taking a force of about 40 men, he made a night march in the pelting rain to surprise the enemy. It reminds us of his later famous exploit at Trenton. The path, he wrote, was hardly wide enough for one man. We often lost it, and could not find it again for 15 or 20 minutes, and we often tumbled over each other in the dark. However, at daybreak on this May day of 1754, they reached the camp of their Indian allies, who in turn took them with stealthy tread to the hollow where lay the French, waiting to ambush the colonists. But it was their turn to be surprised, and they quickly sprang to their feet and grasped their weapons. Washington gave his men the order to fire, the first of many such orders that were to come in the stormy days of 2 successive wars, and in a sense this was the opening gun. A lively but brief skirmish followed. The French lost their commander, Jumonville, and 9 others. The English lost only 1 man killed and 2 or 3 wounded. The remainder of the French, 22 in number, were taken prisoners. The affair made a great stir, and was the forerunner of extended hostilities. Washington foresaw the results immediately, and set his men to constructing a fort which was called Fort Necessity. He had won his first battle, and it greatly inspired his troops. Writing afterwards to his brother Lawrence, he said, "I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound." Their fort, however, was well named, for presently the French and Indians marched down upon them, 900 strong, and as Washington had all told but 300 poorly equipped men, they were compelled to surrender. The terms of surrender were liberal enough, permitting the English to return home with their light arms. Thus did Washington's first campaign come to a somewhat inglorious close. He tendered his resignation, and may have felt humiliated over his defeat, although the House of Burgesses passed a vote of thanks to him and his staff, for their bravery and gallant defense of their country. But later, when Governor Dinwiddie requested him to head another regiment against Fort Duquesne, Washington politely declined. He had not received sufficient support in the first venture to warrant another such attempt. The next stage in the French and Indian War, and likewise in Washington's military development, was the arrival of General Braddock, with 2 regiments of seasoned troops from England. Braddock was an old campaigner of 40 years' experience, who had long since learned all that was to be taught about the art of warfare. He'd teach those French a lesson, and as for the Indians, stuff and nonsense. Braddock's arrival made a great stir in the colonies. It was the first sign of real help from the mother country. The governors of 4 or 5 of the colonies met him at Alexandria. It was near Mount Vernon, and the young retired officer watched the preparations with keenest interest. He could not help contrasting this splendid equipment with the scanty packs which his own men had carried. Much to his delight, he was invited by General Braddock to join his staff as an aide-de-camp, a post which Washington joyfully accepted. Braddock had heard something of the Virginia colonel even before leaving England. It was not so much honoring this colonel officer as immeasurably strengthening his own good right arm, if he had only had the discernment to know it. As results showed, Braddock did not need his heavy cannon nearly so much as he needed an insight into wilderness ways. Just before Braddock started west on his ill-fated expedition, he conferred at Fredericktown, Maryland, with the Postmaster General of Pennsylvania, a strong, practical man, who was to obtain some greatly needed horses and wagons for his artillery and supplies. This man, a middle-aged and rather plain sort of fellow, and the youthful Virginia colonel whom he may have met then for the first time, possibly attracted very little attention in the gaudy military array. But American history could ill have spared either Benjamin Franklin or George Washington. We will not narrate again in detail here the oft-told story of Braddock's defeat, how he insisted on marching across the mountains and valleys of Pennsylvania as though on parade, with banners flying, fifes shrilling, and drums beating. It was a brave display, and such as the old general was accustomed to in Europe. It would undoubtedly put the French and their skulking allies to instant flight. Against such a method of warfare Washington raised his voice of counsel, but in vain. The grizzled veteran brushed him aside. Washington was for rapid marching, with scouting troops deployed on ahead. But this prospect, he writes, was soon clouded, and my hopes brought very low indeed, when I found that instead of pushing on with vigor, without regarding a little rough road, they were halting to level every molehill, and to erect bridges over every brook, by which means we were 4 days in getting 12 miles. A few days before Braddock reached the vicinity of Fort Duquesne, Washington had fallen sick of a fever, and had barely recovered strength enough to rejoin the command. But the slow progress to which he refers enabled him to do so before the attack, though he was still far from well. As he rode up to meet the general, he could not help but admire the beauty of the scene. The troops had crossed a ford on the Monongahela, about 15 miles from the fort, and now marched in close formation along its winding bank, as though on dress parade. But his admiration of the display only intensified his sense of danger, the sixth sense of every woodsman. He begged his general to scatter his forces somewhat, or at least send scouts ahead. But Braddock rebuked him angrily for presuming to teach English regulars how to fight. Suddenly the sound of firing was heard at the front, although no attacking party could be seen. The soldiers had marched straight into an ambush, as Washington had feared. With whoops and yells the Indians, commanded by a few French, were firing from behind every rock and tree. The regulars were thrown into confusion. This type of warfare was new to them. They did not know how to answer it. The front ranks recoiled upon the others, throwing all into wild turmoil. Washington at once threw himself into the fight, counseling, persuading, commanding. A company of Virginians, previously sneered at as raw militia, spread themselves out as a protecting party of skirmishers. The English officers also, be it said, displayed the utmost bravery in trying to rally their men. The general, as though to atone for his headstrong folly, seemed everywhere at once. He had 2 horses shot from under him, before receiving wounds in his own body, which were to prove mortal. It was all over in a comparatively short time. The troops which had so proudly marched, with arms glittering in the sun, were put to rout by an unseen foe. That they were not almost annihilated was due to the presence of Washington and the Virginians. They fought the enemy in kind, and protected the fugitives until some sort of order could be restored. Washington it was who collected the troops and rescued the dying general. He it was who led them back to meet the reinforcements under Dunbar. And he it was who laid the remains of Braddock in the grave, 4 days later, and read the burial service above him. Again had the young soldier to taste the bitter dregs of defeat, but it was salutary, and a part of the iron discipline which was making him into the future leader. That he had not lost any prestige by this experience, but rather gained thereby, is shown by the call that came urgently to him soon after to take command of all the forces of Virginia. He did not want the command, but felt that after such a vote of confidence he could not decline it, and so for 3 years more he struggled on, a general without an army, to protect the western frontier of Virginia against invasion. In April, 1757, he wrote, "I have been posted for more than 20 months past, upon our cold and barren frontiers, to perform, I think I may say, impossibilities. That is, to protect from the cruel incursions of a crafty, savage enemy a line of inhabitants, of more than 350 miles in extent, with a force inadequate to the task." In the winter of 1758 his health broke down completely, and he feared that it was permanently impaired. He resigned his commission and retired to Mount Vernon for a much-needed rest. Thus closes the first and formative period of Washington's life, the period with which the present brief sketch is chiefly concerned. As we read of those years of adventure and hardship from an early age, we realize that here was being hammered into shape upon the anvil of circumstance a very special weapon for some great need. Washington was not an accident. He was a fine example of what special training can do for the boy who does his bit with all his might. And because he was better fitted for the task than any other man in America, we find him, a few years later, chosen to lead the colonist forces against mighty England. A pen picture of him at the time, from the diary of James Thatcher, a surgeon in the Revolution, deserves repeating. The personal appearance of our commander-in-chief is that of a perfect gentleman and accomplished warrior. He is remarkably tall, full 6 feet, erect and well proportioned. The strength and proportion of his joints and muscles appear to be commensurate with the pre-eminent powers of his mind. The serenity of his countenance and majestic gracefulness of his deportment impart a strong impression of that dignity and grandeur which are peculiar characteristics, and no one can stand in his presence without feeling the ascendancy of his mind, and associating with his countenance the idea of wisdom, philanthropy, magnanimity, and patriotism. There is a fine symmetry in the features of his face indicative of a benign and dignified spirit. His nose is straight, and his eyes inclined to blue. He wears his hair in a becoming queue, and from his forehead it is turned back, and powdered in a manner which adds to the military air of his appearance. He displays a native gravity, but devoid of all appearance of ostentation. His uniform dress is a blue coat with 2 brilliant epaulettes, buff-colored underclothes, and a 3-cornered hat with a black cockade. He is constantly equipped with an elegant small sword, boots and spurs, in readiness to mount his noble charger. In this description, somewhat fulsome in its praise, we can read between the lines the confidence and affection which inspired his troops during all the trying days of the Revolution. Washington has suffered much at the hands of his biographers. They have overpraised him, with the result that many readers of today have come to regard him as scarcely human, a sort of demigod. But one or two more recent biographers have had the courage and conviction to tear aside the mask, and we can, if we will, see Washington the man, quick-tempered at times, perhaps profane in the heat of battle, fond of display and good living in his hours of ease, but also a man to be trusted in every crisis, cool, courageous, resourceful, a strategist who made the ablest generals that England could send over against him suffer by comparison. And when the great fight was won, and the last of their proud generals, Cornwallis, had grudgingly yielded up his sword, it is pleasant to think of Washington writing about it to, whom do you think? A white-haired old man, now 90 years of age, who had given the young surveyor his first start in life. Lord Fairfax was an old Tory, an unreconstructed English gentleman of the old school, who drank the king's health religiously every day at dinner. It must have been mixed feelings, therefore, that he heard of Cornwallis's surrender, but pride in his protégé must have conquered. We can imagine him as lifting his glass with trembling fingers to another toast. "Here's to George Washington!" And to that toast grateful America will ever respond. Important dates in Washington's life. 1732. February 22nd. George Washington born. 1747. Left school. 1748. Became a surveyor. 1753. Sent by Governor Dinwiddie on a mission to the French. 1754. Appointed lieutenant colonel and sent against the French and Indians. 1755. Joined General Braddock's staff with rank of colonel. 1757. Resigned his army commission. 1759. Married Martha Dandridge Custis. 1775. Appointed commander-in-chief of American forces in Revolution. 1781. Received surrender of Cornwallis. 1788. Became first president of the United States. 1797. Ended second term as president. 1799. December 14th. Died at Mount Vernon. End of Washington, Part 2.
Section 3 of Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers by J. Walker McSpadden. Grant. Part 1. The Man Who Came Back. Can a man come back? This is a question one frequently hears nowadays, and the answer is more often than not a shrug of the shoulders. For the man who has once failed, or even passed his first chance of success, is not considered seriously in this busy day and time. He is a down-and-outer. He cannot come back. But there are exceptions to every rule, and one of the most striking ones in all history to the above adage is furnished by the man who led the Union forces to victory in the American Civil War, and later achieved the presidency. He was a man who, at 40, was generally regarded as a failure, a ne'er-do-well, but for the accident of war he would in all likelihood have ended his days unwept, unhonored, and unsung. We have a picture of this middle-aged man clerking for his younger brothers in a country store, at $800 a year, and day by day sinking further into the slough of despond. He was of little real value to the store, even at that meager salary. He was no good at driving bargains or at palavering with the trade. He tried to keep out of sight as much as possible among the boxes and shelves. His clothing was poor and shabby, his hair and beard long and unkempt. The brand of failure was stamped all over him. Yet this was the man who in 5 short years was to become the most famous military leader of his day. The life story of Ulysses Simpson Grant abounds in strange paradoxes. If ever a man was made the plaything of fate, it was he. His career has ever persuaded some writers into the belief that he was the man of mystery. His father, Jesse Grant, was a self taught man who is said to have received but 6 months' actual schooling in his life. He was all the more determined that his son, Ulysses, should have the education that he lacked. We find him intervening more than once to drive the boy contrary to the latter's wishes, but to his later good. The father was tall, about 6 feet, rugged and aggressive, making friends and enemies with equal readiness. Ulysses' mother, however, was quiet, self-possessed, and patient, qualities which she afterwards gave the boy. Jesse Grant said of her in later years, "Her steadiness and strength of character have been the stay of the family through life." At the time of Ulysses' birth, April 27, 1822, the family were living in Port Pleasant, Clermont County, Ohio. But when he was still an infant, they removed to Georgetown, a few miles away, where his father established a tannery. At this time the town was little more than a clearing hewed out from the virgin forest. Wood was plentiful and cheap, and for this reason Mr. Grant bought a tract of land and set up his tannery. Ulysses, or Lys, as the neighbors called him, was the oldest of 6 children, 3 boys and 3 girls. As soon as Ulysses was old enough, his father started him to school. There were no public schools in those days, so he went to a school maintained by private subscription and taught by a man named John White. White had his own notions about a curriculum, and one of the most important was discipline. On top of his desk always reposed a bundle of good husky switches, except at frequently recurring times when they were beating a tattoo on some hapless scholar's back. It was his boast that he often used up a whole bunch in a single day. However, his school was no different from many another at the time. Beatings were taken as a matter of course. Spare the rod and spoil the child. Ulysses went to this school until he was 14 and mastered the elementary studies. Between whiles he helped his father at the tannery or on the farm. The tannery work he always hated, but outdoor work, particularly with horses, he delighted in. At 7 years of age he drove a team with all the skill of a man, and it was said that when he could scarcely walk he could ride horseback. The story is told of him that at a county fair, where a prize of $5 was offered to anyone who could stick on a trick pony, Ulysses won it after several other boys had got thrown helter-skelter. He flung his arms around the pony's fat neck and stuck on, though, as he afterward said, the pony was round as an apple. He tells another amusing story of himself in these early days. He greatly coveted a young colt owned by a neighboring farmer, and after teasing his father, the latter tried to buy it for him. But he offered only $20 for the colt, and the owner wanted $25. After some dickering without any result, the boy went to the owner with this message, which he delivered all in a breath: "Father says I may offer you $20, and if you won't take that, I am to offer you 22.5, and if you won't take that for the colt, I am to pay you $25. It would not take a Connecticut farmer to tell what was the price paid for the colt," he added afterward when telling the story. This little incident, while amusing, reveals a trait in his character which persisted all through life. He was the soul of candor. He called a spade, and he never could bargain. Another early trait revealing itself in later years was something that, in his memoirs, he calls a superstition. It was a dislike to turn back when once started on a journey. If he found himself on the wrong road, he would keep going until he came to some branching road rather than turn aside. This habit was destined to make some of the generals on the other side in the Civil War somewhat uncomfortable. They found that he never quit. Thus grew up the boy Ulysses Grant. He was not considered particularly bright at school, but he was a plodder, going along keeping his own counsel. He could not talk readily even in a small company, and was hopeless when it came to speaking a piece on Friday at the school. But he was a sturdy outdoor boy, by this time remarkably proficient with horses. At the age of 15 he had explored the back country for miles round about. His father, however, had never lost sight of the fact that the boy was to get a good schooling, and he frequently brought up the subject, to Lys's discomfort. The lad was not especially keen for any more books, but the opportunity came, just as others were to come, to shape the whole course of young Grant's life. The son of a neighbor had received an appointment to West Point, but had failed to pass the entrance examination. Jesse Grant immediately wrote to the congressman of the district in behalf of Ulysses. Although the two men were on opposite political sides and had quarreled bitterly, "If you have no other person in view, and feel willing to consent to the appointment of Ulysses, will you please signify that consent to the department?" Ulysses got the appointment, despite the political feud, and it is pleasant to note that the two men healed their differences and became good friends again. The boy received news of his appointment without much enthusiasm. He would much rather be a horse trader, he told his father, but the latter was determined, and Ulysses went. Nor did his appointment please others in the village, who thought the boy dull. One man, meeting Mr. Grant in the street, said bluntly, "I hear that your boy is going to West Point. Why didn't our representative pick some one that would be a credit to the district?" This ill-natured speech may have been inspired by the fact that political feeling ran high at the time, and Jesse Grant, as a staunch Whig and Northerner, had made a good many enemies. Ulysses was coached for West Point at an academy at Ripley, Ohio, conducted by William Taylor, and passed his entrance examinations with fair grades. His best study was mathematics. He entered at the age of 17. It took young Grant many a long day to accustom himself to the military academy. The hazing encountered by every freshman he didn't seem to mind, so that the older men soon let him alone. But the drill and the dress, to this farm lad, was deadly. These were the days of the ramrod tactics of Winfield Scott, the starch and stock and buckram days of the army. Old Fuss and Feathers, his critics called him, but with all his love of pomp and circumstance, Scott was a splendid soldier, whether on the drill ground or in the face of the enemy. Nevertheless, to Grant it was a constant trial at first. He felt like a fish out of water. General Charles King thus speaks of him: phlegmatic in temperament and long given to ease and deliberation in all his movements at home, this springing to attention at the tap of the drum, this snapping together of the heels at the sound of a sergeant's voice, this sudden freezing to a rigid pose without the move of a muscle except at the word of command, was something almost beyond him. It seemed utterly unnatural, if not utterly repugnant. Accustomed to swinging along the winding banks of the White Oak or the cow paths of the pasture lot, this moving only at a measured pace of 28 inches and 110 to the minute, all in strict unison with the step of the guide on the marching flank or at the head of the column, came 10 times harder than ever did the pages of analytical or the calculus. Grant had no sense of rhythm. He had no joy in martial music. The thrill and inspiration of the drum and fife, or the beautiful harmonies of the old Academy band, were utterly lost on him. In all that class of 1843 it may well be doubted if there lived one solitary soul who found there less to like or more to shrink from than this 17-year-old lad, who, thanks to the opportunities and to the training there given them, was in less than a quarter of a century to be hailed as the foremost soldier of more than 2 millions of men in the Union blue. But this was only one of the Grant paradoxes, the contradictions which were to mark his strange career. Life at West Point was not all hardship, however. In his quiet way Grant made a few warm friends. On account of his initials he was promptly nicknamed Uncle Sam, which was soon shortened to Sam. He excelled in two widely different courses, mathematics and horsemanship. We have already noticed his early skill with and love for horses. Now it was to stand him in good stead. He was assigned during one year to a particularly intractable young horse, a big raw-boned sorrel named York. One of York's tricks was to rear and throw himself backward with his rider. But in Grant he found his master, and the steed not only grew tractable, but developed under his rider's training into a famous jumper. Horse and rider are vividly described by General James B. Fry in his Reminiscences. The class, still mounted, was formed in line through the center of the hall. The riding master placed the leaping bar higher than a man's head and called out, "Cadet Grant." A clean-faced, slender, blue-eyed young fellow, weighing about 120 pounds, dashed from the ranks on a powerfully built chestnut sorrel horse and galloped down the opposite side of the hall. As he turned at the farther end and came into the stretch at which the bar was placed, the horse increased his pace, and, measuring his stride for the great leap before him, bounded into the air and cleared the bar, carrying his rider as if man and beast had been welded together. The spectators were breathless. Sam Grant graduated from the Military Academy in July, 1843, one of 39 out of a class that had originally numbered 100. Among his classmates were Sherman, Thomas, Meade, Reynolds, and other soldiers later known to fame. It cannot be said, however, that his entry into the army was auspicious. He was still by no means reconciled to the idea of being a soldier. He had not received the assignment he had coveted, the dragoons, and moreover his health was poor. He was troubled with a persistent cough which indicated weak lungs, but thanks to his life in the open and horseback riding, he escaped a possible attack of consumption. After a 3 months' furlough, visiting his father's home, now at Bethel, Ohio, he reported for duty at the Jefferson Barracks, near St. Louis, as a second lieutenant in the infantry. The best horseman in his class had to walk. But there were compensations. Outside of duty, Grant could always procure a mount, and about 5 miles away from the barracks, just an easy canter, was the home of his college chum and roommate, Lieutenant Frederick T. Dent. The Dents had a big, hospitable country place, and they speedily made Fred's friend feel at home. One member of the family, who had heard much about Sam Grant from her brother's letters long before Grant appeared in person, was Julia Dent, now a charming girl of 17. It was not long before her friends began teasing her about the little lieutenant with the big epaulets, and while she laughed and blushed, she didn't seem to mind. The little round of social gaieties, however, was of brief duration. Trouble with Mexico was brewing, and in 1844 relations had become so strained that an army of observation, as it was called, was assembled under General Zachary Taylor, "Old Rough and Ready," on the border. Grant's company was ordered to join this army on the briefest notice. The young lieutenant had time only for a brief leave-taking with the Dents, and one member in particular, but her final message meant all the world to him. In March of the next year, Congress sanctioned the annexation of Texas, and trouble with Mexico began in earnest. History records the rapid course of events which made up the Mexican War. We can only notice the events which directly concerned the career of Grant. His company was part of the expeditionary force of 3,000 men destined to see active service on the border. By the middle of March they had reached the Rio Grande and pitched camp opposite the city of Matamoras. The army was far from its base of supplies and in a country swarming with the enemy. Before war was formally declared, 2 officers who were caught outside the camp were killed, and 2 whole companies captured. There was no railroad, and General Taylor was compelled to send a considerable force back 25 miles for supplies. On the 3rd of May, the returning troops encountered a much larger force of Mexicans. A battle followed, which continued after sundown. During the night, the Mexicans retreated, but were found further on in a much stronger position. They awaited the Americans on the far side of a pond, their position being further fortified by logs and branches of trees. The captain of Grant's company was temporarily absent, and it fell to Grant to lead their advance. By this time bullets were humming merrily, but he directed his men to deploy to one side and approached through thicker woods. At last they reached a clearing near the head of the pond, and he ordered a charge. They captured the position immediately in front of them and made a few prisoners, including 1 colonel. The engagement all along the line had been too brisk for the Mexicans, and they broke and ran, leaving a considerable quantity of guns and ammunition. As for the little lieutenant, it was his first battle and first command of a company, and he had reason to feel satisfied with the day's work. End of Grant, Part 1. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. Section 4 of Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers by J. Walker McSpadden. Grant, Part 2. As one result of the engagement, the Americans now crossed the river and became an army of invasion. And now that the war had actually begun, volunteers began to flock to the standard. The ensuing months of that year were packed with incident and no little danger. In August, Grant was made quartermaster and commissary of the regiment, a position of responsibility, which he held until the army was withdrawn. Although Grant's duties were now such as to withdraw him from active fighting, he was not the man to take advantage of the fact. The lively battle of Monterey bears witness to this. After a hard encounter on the outskirts of the city, the Americans stormed it from the north and east, and began to drive the Mexicans out, street by street. But when the citadel was in sight, the commanding officer, Colonel Garland, found to his dismay that they were short of ammunition. "We must have ammunition at once," he announced to his men. "Who will volunteer to ride back with the message? I do not wish to detail anyone, as it is extra hazardous." At once Lieutenant Grant stepped forward and saluted. "I will go, Colonel," he said. "You are just the man. If anybody can ride through, you can. But hurry." And Grant did. Crouching low on his mustang like an Indian, he dashed down the bullet-swept streets, made the open, and delivered his message to General Twigg. The Mexican War was marked by the political rivalry of 2 American generals, one of whom was destined to win the highest honor in the gift of his country, General Zachary Taylor, Old Rough and Ready, and General Winfield Scott, Fuss and Feathers. Both were able leaders, though totally unlike in their methods. Taylor cared nothing for personal appearance or etiquette. He worked in close contact with his men. Scott, on the contrary, was fond of display, and issued his orders through his staff officers. Scott was now given supreme command of the Mexican campaign, and summoned all the regular troops for an invasion by way of Vera Cruz, the scene of a later landing in very recent years. Taylor was left with only the volunteers, but he utilized them at Buena Vista to such good effect that at the next election old Rough and Ready became President of the United States, the very thing that his political foes at Washington had tried to prevent by giving Scott the supreme command. Grant's company, with other regulars to the number of 8,000 men, landed at Vera Cruz, and early in April began its perilous march into the interior. Roads had to be built and bridges constructed, and the army engineers toiled night and day. Among them were two young West Pointers, George B. McClellan and Robert E. Lee. Thus it was that Grant and Lee first came to know each other in the wilds of Mexico. By the middle of May they had reached Puebla, which they captured easily. But the army needed supplies, and Quartermaster Grant was sent out with an escort of 1,000 men to forage the surrounding country. They filled their wagons and returned safely. This jaunt delighted Grant's soul. It was far better than bringing up the rear on a dusty line of march. In one of his letters home he writes: "I have been delighted with the Mexican birds. Their plumage is superlatively splendid. They beat ours in show, but to my mind do not equal them in harmony. I have written this letter with my sword fastened to my side, my pistols within reach, not knowing but that the next moment I may be called into battle." It is an odd coincidence that at a later day we find another soldier destined to lead his country's armies to victory in a far mightier conflict, using the soil of Mexico as a training ground. That soldier was John J. Pershing. One other exploit of Grant's in the Mexican campaign must be mentioned, as it was not only daring, but it also revealed his resourcefulness. During the attack on Chapultepec, Grant noticed that one of the two main routes, the San Cosme road, was flanked by a small mission church surmounted by a belfry. He reasoned that if they could mount a howitzer in the belfry, that section would be made mighty uncomfortable for the Mexicans. He went at once to a superior officer, explained his plan, and secured a detail of men with one gun. The gun had to be taken to pieces, but with it in hand they compelled the priest to open the church doors to them, mounted the steps to the belfry, reassembled the gun, and it was soon beating a lively tattoo down upon the backs of the astonished Mexicans. For his gallant conduct at Chapultepec, as the official citation read, Grant won his brevet of captain. With the signing of the treaty of peace, Grant came home on furlough, and in August 1848 was married to Julia Dent. He took his wife to his father's home, and was made much of by his admiring townsmen. His father was inordinately proud of my Ulysses, now a captain, and cited for gallantry in action. In the darker days that were to follow, he looked back to this time as the very pinnacle of his son's greatness. That there were darker days, and many of them, must be chronicled in any true sketch of Ulysses S. Grant. He was to taste the very dregs of humiliation and despair. He was to see these same admiring friends turn from him one by one, with a sneer or a reproachful shake of the head. For days of peace were at hand, long days of barracks routine and enforced idleness. To Captain Grant, these days, coming after the excitement of Mexico, were at first welcome, then speedily grew tedious. He had always hated the humdrum life of the drill ground. Now he was shifted, after a few months, to a camp at San Francisco. The distance was so great, traveling as they did by way of the Isthmus of Panama. This was long before the railroads, that he could not take his wife with him. His slender pay also would not admit of it. Life in all the army camps was free and easy. Liquor flowed freely, and drunkenness was unfortunately common. Grant, like others, drank, but not to excess. With him, however, one glass was sufficient to flush his face and render his walk unsteady. It was not long before the life at this far removed Western camp began to tell upon him. He quarreled with his commanding officer, and finally resigned from the service. He had to borrow money in order to return home, a long and painful journey by way of New York, and it was a discouraged, broken-looking man who greeted his wife and his parents. This was the summer of 1854. Captain Grant was then only 32, but it already seemed as though the best and only valuable part of his life was behind him. The recent conquering hero, with his dashing uniform and epaulets, had become a somewhat seedy-looking individual, with shoulders prematurely stooped and shuffling gait. The word speedily went round the village, with many a nod and wink. "Told you so. Went up like a rocket, came down like a stick." His wife, however, had not lost her confidence in him. Through all the trying days that were to follow, she remained staunch and loyal. She persuaded her father to let her have a 60-acre tract of land near St. Louis. There she brought Ulysses and their children, and there he began life anew as a plain farmer. He built with his own hands a log house of 4 rooms, with chimneys at each end and wide fireplaces. With grim humor he called the place Hardscrabble. But he liked the place. He liked the freedom of it, with his horses and other livestock. Despite its hardship, he welcomed it as an escape from the petty exactions of military life. Nevertheless, he could not make it pay. He did not have sufficient capital or bodily strength to succeed. An attack of chills and fever in 1858 put the finishing touch to this episode, and he sold his stock and the farm the following spring. During the ensuing few months he moved from pillar to post, trying various ventures and succeeding with none. The fates seemed against him. In St. Louis, whither he had drifted, he was regarded with open scorn as what we would now designate a down and out. One reason for his poor success lay in the fact that he was a Northerner, and the city was seething with talk of secession. The clouds of civil war were already gathering, and men began to distrust each his neighbor. At this juncture his father, who seems rather to have turned against him also, came to his relief. He offered Ulysses a position in his leather business, now in charge of the younger boys. Ulysses thankfully accepted, although the pay was only $50 a month. He brought his wife and boys to Galena, where at any rate he was sure of having a roof over his head. The brothers found him of no earthly account at driving bargains or tending store, says General Charles King. He could keep books after a fashion and do some of the heavy work in handling the miscellaneous stock. Another soldier, who became his devoted follower in the later days, had his first sight of Grant at this down-at-the-heels period. "I went round to the store," he says. "It was a sharp winter morning, and there wasn't a sign of a soldier or one that looked like a soldier about the shop. But pretty soon a farmer drove up with a lot of hides on his sleigh, and went inside the dicker, and presently a stoop-shouldered, brownish-bearded fellow, with a slouch hat pulled down over his eyes, who had been sitting whittling at the stove when I came inside, came out, pulling on an old light blue soldier's overcoat. He flung open the doors leading down into the cellar, laid hold of the top hide, frozen stiff it was, tugged it loose, towed it over, and slung it down the chute. Then one by one, all by himself, he heaved off the rest of 'em. A 10 minutes' tough job in that weather, until he had got the last of them down the cellar, then slouched back into the store again, shed the blue coat, got some hot water off the stove, and went and washed his hands using a cake of brown soap, then came back and went to whittling again, and all without a word to anybody. That was my first look at Grant, and look at him now. But in all likelihood there would not have been another chance to look at him had not the great Civil War broken out. It was to prove in his case that what seemed failure was merely lack of opportunity. When South Carolina seceded and the call for troops came, the stoop-shouldered clerk in the hide store began to straighten up. The call to arms put new life in his blood. He felt his old confidence returning. He refused a local captaincy after he had demonstrated what he could do in drilling recruits, saying, "I have been in the military service 14 years, and think I am competent to command a regiment." He went to Springfield, Illinois, and offered his services, and after some delay was given a desk job in the adjutant general's office. It was not long before he proved his efficiency, and his advice was sought more and more by the governor in organizing the state guards. When the 21st Regiment was mustered into service, he was made its colonel. He had put his foot on the first rung of the ladder of success. The 21st, like other bodies of volunteers, was a loosely knit, unruly set of men. They took military life as a huge picnic, but speedily got over that attitude under Grant. On their first long hike, it is said that their canteens were filled with whiskey instead of water, until Grant went through on a personal tour of inspection and ordered every canteen emptied out on the ground. The way he took hold of that regiment and licked it into shape opened the eyes of Governor Yates and his staff. In 2 months it was the best drilled regiment in the state, and when President Lincoln wrote to the governor asking suggestions for promotions, Grant's name headed the list. He was made a brigadier general. The story of the Civil War and Grant's great part therein belong to a longer chronicle than this. Step by step this stern, quiet soldier fought his way up, winning his country's battles and his own as well. In the full tide of war he found himself, and better still, his country discovered him. He was never after to prove recreant to his trust. "We will fight it out along this line if it takes all summer," is one of his typical remarks, and one most often quoted. It was toward the last of the hard-fought war, when the Southern forces under Lee were doing their utmost to fend off the inevitable. Grant, now commanding general of the Union forces, was still putting into practice the quiet, bulldog qualities that had led his armies to victory. Then came the final dramatic scene, at the historic surrender at Appomattox. Lee had come to discuss terms with him, and now stood awaiting his arrival, erect, courtly, handsome, the typical Southern gentleman that he was. Down the road came riding a gaunt-looking man, with the familiar stoop shoulders and the mud-bespattered trousers and boots. It was the general-in-chief, on his way to greet his beaten foe. The two men looked each other in the eye, then clasped hands like old friends. Grant recalled the days of the Mexican campaign, and was surprised that Lee knew so much about him in those days. He wanted to talk old times, and Lee himself brought up the subject of surrender. Grant took his seat at a table and wrote out the simple and generous terms which allowed officers and men to return to their homes on giving their word not to take up arms against the United States government again. Lee's fine, dignified features softened as he read the terms, so much more magnanimous than he had dared to hope. "My men are nearly starving," he began. "What do you need?" interrupted Grant, and gave instant orders that the defeated army should be supplied with rations. "Tell the boys to go home and go to work," he said. That was Grant. Important dates in Grant's life: 1822, April 27th, Ulysses Simpson Grant born. 1839, received appointment to the U.S. Military Academy, West Point. 1843, graduated. 1845, went as second lieutenant to join Taylor's forces in Mexico. 1848, brevetted captain for gallantry. 1848, married Julia T. Dent. 1854, resigned his army commission. 1861, re-entered army at outbreak of Civil War, commissioned colonel, then brigadier general. 1863, made major general. 1864, given supreme command of the Union forces with rank of lieutenant general. 1866, the grade of general created for the first time, and conferred on him. 1868, elected president. 1885, July 23rd, died at Mount McGregor, New York. End of Grant, Part 2. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. Section 5 of Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers by J. Walker McSpadden. Lee, Part 1. Lee, the leader of a lost cause. A gray-haired college president sat talking kindly with a young sophomore who had fallen behind in his studies. "My boy," he said, "you must study if you would succeed. Only patience and industry will prevent your failure here and your failure in after life." "But, General, you failed," replied the sophomore with an amazing impertinence. "I hope that you may be more fortunate than I," was the quiet answer. Literature contains nothing finer than that by way of the retort courteous. The speaker was Robert E. Lee. The time, not many months after the surrender of the Southern army. Many were there to brand him as a failure, just as this thoughtless sophomore had done, and to all such critics his reply was silence. In the seclusion of a small Virginia college he lived and worked, keeping sedulously out of public affairs, writing and saying nothing about his campaigns. He left to history the final verdict, which has found him not a failure, but one of the most brilliant soldiers of this or any land. In Lee's early life and ancestry, his nearest parallel is Washington. These two great Virginians were born within a few miles of each other in Westmoreland County. Lee was born just 75 years after Washington, January 19, 1807, and like him was descended of famous lineage. His father, Light Horse Harry Lee, fought by the side of Washington in the Revolutionary War, and it was he who in a memorial address on the great leader coined the immortal phrase, "First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen." Still another ancestor, Richard Henry Lee, had been born many years earlier in the same old mansion where Robert Edward Lee first saw the light of day. Richard Lee it was who was a boyhood friend and confidant of George Washington, and who later became one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. It is not strange, therefore, to find that the career of the first great Virginian profoundly influenced the second. One familiar with the life of Lee says Thomas Nelson Page cannot help noting the strong resemblance of his character in its strength, its poise, its rounded completeness to that of Washington, or fail to mark what influence the life of Washington had on the life of Lee. The stamp appears upon it from his boyhood and grows more plain as his years progress. The old homestead in which Lee was born deserves some notice on its own account. It was built by Thomas Lee, a grandson of Richard Lee, the immigrant who came to Virginia about the time that Charles I was losing both his crown and his head. While Charles II was still in exile, the same Thomas Lee offered the king a haven in Virginia, which was not accepted. The original brick structure was destroyed by fire, but the house was rebuilt on the same site during the time of Queen Anne, and it is said that she aided in its reconstruction. This was the ancestral home of the Lees for several generations. Robert E. Lee, though naturally proud of his lineage, never showed great interest in the family tree. He never had the time or the inclination to study genealogy, and always said that he knew nothing of it beyond the fact that Colonel Richard Lee had come to America during the reign of Charles I. Upon having a family seal and crest made, he apologized for the seeming parade by saying, "I have thought, perhaps foolishly enough, that it might as well be right as wrong." Later, however, when approached on the subject of publishing a family history, he wrote, "I am very much obliged to Mr. for the trouble he has taken in relation to the Lee genealogy. I have no desire to have it published, and do not think it would afford sufficient interest beyond the immediate family to pay for the expense. I think the money had better be appropriated to relieve the poor." Harry Lee, Robert's father, was not only a soldier but also a man of letters. He loved the classics, and has left memoirs written in spirited vein. He had reached middle life, however, before Robert was born, and passed away when the boy was 11. It was the mother's influence, and here again we have a parallel with Washington, which was paramount in the early days. She was a Carter, of equally old and distinguished family, and is spoken of as an amiable and gracious lady. When Robert was still a child, his family moved to Alexandria, and very shortly his father went away on a trip for his health, from which he never returned. Between the boy and his mother the ties became very close. He was devoted to her, and on her part she said, after he went away to school, "You have been both son and daughter to me." Long afterward Lee alludes to this period in a letter to his own son by way of counsel. "A young gentleman who has read Virgil must surely be competent to take care of two ladies, for before I had advanced that far I was my mother's outdoor agent and confidential messenger." Robert Lee obtained his first schooling at the old academy in Alexandria, then taught by a Mr. Leary, who remained always his good friend. Later he attended a better known school, conducted by a strict Quaker, Benjamin Hallowell. Brimstone Castle the boys called it, solely on account of the color of the brick walls. Hallowell himself was rarely, if ever, brimstone in character, though he could be stern enough on occasion. He thee'd and thou'd in the most orthodox style, and decried all warfare. Despite his pacifist teachings, however, young Lee's earliest ambition was to become a soldier. It was in his blood. He was fond of outdoor sports, especially hunting and horseback riding. His lifelong fondness for horses brings to mind the same trait in Grant, his later antagonist. In his older days Lee would tell with enthusiasm how as a boy he had followed the hunt, not infrequently on foot, for hours over hill and valley without tiring. Again he wrote, "I know the pleasure of training a handsome horse. I enjoy it as much as anyone." His famous steed Traveler was known throughout the Army of Virginia during the war, and the sight of him caused many an eye to grow moist as he followed riderless the remains of his beloved master to their last resting place. At the Hallowell School Lee chiefly excelled in mathematics, a study which was later to be of great value to him in the engineers corps of the army. Hallowell paid a tribute to his pupil after the latter became famous, saying, "He was a most exemplary student in every respect." One could wish, however, that instead of such idle compliments, the schoolmaster had really searched his memory and given us some personal anecdotes of Lee at school. There is actually very little on record about his early life. He seems to have grown into an attractive and likable boy, studious, somewhat reserved, and by no means remarkable. One kinswoman writes, "I have often said since he entered on his brilliant career that although we all admired him for his remarkable beauty and attractive manners, I did not see anything in him that prepared me for his so far outstripping all his compeers." Lee's older brother Sidney had already entered the Navy, and Lee himself decided upon the Army as his choice of profession. At the age of 18 he applied for a cadetship at the Military Academy at West Point, and received it direct from President Andrew Jackson himself. There is a tradition that when Lee presented himself before the hero of New Orleans, that doughty Tennessean looked him over from head to foot, then passed him on with the terse comment, "You'll do." And Robert Lee did. In college he made a record that shines to this day. He was given the coveted cadet adjutancy of his corps. He graduated second in a class of 46, and he did not receive a single demerit during his entire college career for rusty gun, or cap on the floor, or late at drill, or twisted belt, or any of the 101 things that are the bane and stumbling block of the West Pointer's existence. Such a record seems almost too good to be true, and one is tempted to wish for at least one escapade to enliven the narrative. Yet Lee was by no means a prig. Even his detractors of later years never accused him of that. He was popular with his fellows and fond of the give and take of the drill ground. His ability to make and hold friends was one of the outstanding traits of his whole life. His men who followed him through the lost cause fairly idolized him. General Joseph E. Johnson, another Southern leader, was a classmate of his at West Point, and gives us this description of him there: "We had the same intimate associates, who thought as I did that no other youth or man so united the qualities that win warm friendship and command high respect. For he was full of sympathy and kindness, genial, and fond of gay conversation and even fun, and while his correctness of demeanor and attention to all duties, personal and official, and a dignity as much a part of himself as the elegance of his person, gave him a superiority that every one acknowledged in his heart. He was the only one of all the men I have known that could laugh at the faults and follies of his friends in such a manner as to make them ashamed without touching their affection for him." Lee graduated from West Point with the class of '29 and the rank of second lieutenant of the engineers. His first important move after leaving school was to choose for wife Mary Custis, daughter of George Washington Parke Custis of Arlington, the last branch of the Washington family. Here again the fates linked up the names of Washington and Lee. The two homes at Arlington and Mount Vernon were only a few miles apart on the Potomac, and as a final link in the chain we find, years after, at the close of his life, Lee was giving his last efforts to building up Washington College, which was to be known thereafter as Washington and Lee. When Mary Custis became Mrs. Robert E. Lee, there was some disparity in their fortunes. She was the heiress of the Custis estate, while he was drawing only the meager pay of a second lieutenant. But such was her pride and confidence in him that she turned her back on money and decided to live on her husband's income. It was harsh training for a time, but it fitted her to become a real helpmate for him, and in the rigorous days of the Civil War she was glad that she had learned early to do without. One of Lieutenant Lee's first assignments in the engineering corps was the construction of harbor defenses in Hampton Roads. As he labored to make these as strong as possible, he little dreamed that it would be his problem, a quarter of a century later, to study how he might demolish them. From Hampton Roads he was transferred to Washington and made assistant to the chief engineer, an agreeable change, as it brought him close to his wife's home. Mounted on a favorite steed, he could easily commute back and forth between office and home. On one occasion it is related that he invited a brother officer, Captain McComb, out home for the night. As the latter had no mount, Lee took him up behind himself, and down Pennsylvania Avenue they went, saluting other officers whom they encountered with great glee. That was one time when a commutation ticket was good for two. 5 years after graduation he had worked up to a first lieutenancy, and 2 years more found him a captain. In 1835 he was appointed on a commission to fix the boundary line between Michigan and Ohio. A few months later he was detailed to make an important study of the Mississippi River and valley, with a view to determining how to prevent the annual overflows with their consequent damage to property. His researches were chiefly along the upper river at Illinois. It is said that while there he was struck with the enormous potential energy of the current, and reported that if a dam were constructed at a certain place, a great storehouse of power would be possible. This was long before the day of the dynamo, by which such power could be harnessed. Many years later, however, his dream came true at the place he had indicated, the great power dam nearly a mile long, blocking the Father of Waters for the first time in its tumultuous career, at Keokuk, Iowa. Farther downstream, above St. Louis, he began a system of river improvements which aroused no little opposition among property owners. The dispute that arose was one of the first things which brought the name of Robert E. Lee to public attention, but despite the short-sighted protests of some citizens of St. Louis, Lee went quietly ahead and carried the work through to the permanent betterment of the city. "I was sent here to do certain work, and I shall do it," was his terse comment. When he had completed his work on the Mississippi, he was sent to New York to complete the harbor defenses at Fort Hamilton, down at the gateway of the city. He had made captain of engineers by this time, and was looked upon as one of the ablest men in his line of work in the army. It was not long before his mettle was to be tested in actual warfare. The trouble with Mexico, which had been smoldering for several years, at length burst into flame. After the first victories along the border under General Zach Taylor, a campaign from the sea was undertaken under General Winfield Scott, who landed at Vera Cruz. The purpose was to march overland to the capital, reducing the country as they went, and to make this possible the army engineers were in demand. They answered the call gladly, for the spirit of adventure ran high, and every army officer welcomed the chance to see active service. In the Corps of Engineers we find several names destined to become famous: Lee, Beauregard, McClellan, Foster, Tower, Stevens, Totten, and others, while Grant was attached to the commissary of the same army. It was in effect a training school for the great drama of a few short years later. Captain Lee was placed on the personal staff of General Scott, and given supervision of important road and bridge building. In a letter to his wife, dated Rio Grande, October 11, 1846, he writes: "We have met with no resistance yet, The Mexicans who were guarding the passage retired on our approach. There has been a great whetting of knives, grinding of swords, and sharpening of bayonets ever since we reached the river." This was written while serving with General Wool in northern Mexico. He took part in the battle of Buena Vista, his first engagement, and was then summoned to Vera Cruz by Scott. This doughty old general and former commandant at West Point had all along shown a great partiality for Lee, and in the campaign which was to follow we find him constantly writing of his young staff officer in glowing terms. One such incident is typical. Lee had undertaken alone an all-night exploration of a desolate lava tract called Pedregal, which had been shunned by scouts and troopers alike. It was treacherous country, difficult to traverse, and possibly infested by the enemy. General Scott writes: "I had dispatched several staff officers who had, within the space of 2 hours, returned and reported to me that each had found it impracticable to penetrate far into Pedregal during the dark. Captain Lee, having passed over the difficult ground by daylight, found it just possible to return to St. Augustine in the dark. The greatest feat of physical and moral courage performed by any individual in my knowledge pending the campaign." Another general, P. F. Smith, also bears tribute to this and other such feats. I wish partially to record my admiration for the conduct of Captain Lee of the Engineers. His reconnaissances, though pushed far beyond the bounds of prudence, were conducted with so much skill that their fruits were of the utmost value, the soundness of his judgment and personal daring being equally conspicuous. End of Lee, Part 1. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. Section 6 of Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers by J. Walker McSpadden. Lee, Part 2. At Vera Cruz, Lee had the pleasure of meeting his older brother, from whom he had long been separated. This was Lieutenant Sidney Smith Lee, who had entered the Navy before Robert went to West Point. Now, for the first time, the brothers, sailor and soldier, fought side by side. But it was with mixed feelings that Robert Lee passed through this experience. He was brave enough on his own account, but he constantly trembled for Sidney. He had placed a battery in position to reduce the town, and thus describes the ensuing action: "The first day this battery opened, Smith served one of the guns. I had constructed the battery, and was there to direct its fire. No matter where I turned, my eyes reverted to him, and I stood by his gun whenever I was not wanted elsewhere. Oh, I felt awfully, and am at a loss what I should have done had he been cut down before me. I thank God that he was saved. He preserved his usual cheerfulness, and I could see his white teeth through all the smoke and din of the fire." When the soldiers moved inland after capturing Vera Cruz, the sailors were left behind, and Lee had to bid his brother farewell. The records of the 6 months' campaign in Mexico contain many references to Lee's skill and bravery. He was then 40 years old, in the heyday of his vigor. He would remain in the saddle from dawn to twilight if necessary, and never shirked the duty. No wonder that Scott was proud of him and came to rely upon him more and more. At Chapultepec, he writes, Captain Lee was constantly conspicuous, bearing important orders till he fainted from a wound and the loss of 2 nights' sleep at the batteries. The campaign certainly showed that Lee was a soldier and the son of a soldier. He was repeatedly cited for meritorious conduct, and was brevetted major, lieutenant colonel, and colonel in rapid succession. This proved not merely his bravery, but his ability in planning engagements and discovering the weak points of the enemy, features which he was to turn to such remarkable account in many famous battles of the Civil War. When peace with Mexico was declared, Lee was given a welcome furlough, and went back to Arlington to visit his wife and children. He had been so constantly away from home that he failed to recognize his youngest son, whom he had left as an infant, and it is said that he himself was first recognized by a faithful dog. His son and namesake, R. E. Lee, in his recollections, speaks of his father's love for animals. He once rescued a dog that was near drowning in the Narrows, and it became his devoted follower through life. In a letter home he writes, one of many such references, "Cannot you cure poor Speck, his dog? Cheer him up. Take him to walk with you, and tell the children to cheer him up. We have already spoken of his favorite horse, Traveler. After the Great War, during which horse and rider were inseparable, Lee wrote a description and tribute to his equine friend which must appeal to every true lover of horses." Lee's two elder sons held true to the family traditions by both entering West Point. Lee himself was presently sent there by the government as superintendent, just 23 years after he had graduated. He served in this capacity for 3 years, then was given an assignment to the cavalry, with rank of lieutenant colonel. For the next 5 years his duty took him into several states, chiefly in the West and Southwest. It was an unsettled time on the border, both from the Mexicans at the South and the Indians in the West, and constant police duty was necessary. It was arduous, and lacked the thrill of a real campaign, but in any event it kept Lee from growing rusty as a soldier. Unconsciously to him and to his government, it was shaping him and fitting him for the great drama just ahead. For slowly but surely the North and the South were drifting apart. At first the discussion had been political, but now it was growing more and more personal and bitter. The disputed questions were slavery and states' rights. A preliminary cloud in the sky was the fanatical raid of John Brown, who in 1859 tried to stir up the negroes of Northern Virginia against their masters. The raid was promptly crushed at Harper's Ferry, and Lee with his regiment of cavalry assisted in restoring order. But though John Brown's body lay a mouldering in the grave, his soul went marching on. While many Southerners did not own slaves and did not believe in slavery, the question of states' rights found them with undivided front. Had not this doctrine been expressly implied in the Federal Constitution? Had not this right been invoked more than once in the North, by the staunch state of Massachusetts, for example, as early as 1809 and as lately as 1842? Thus they reasoned, and when matters at last reached the breaking point in 1861, the Southern states, following South Carolina's lead one by one, felt that they were acting only within their recognized rights. The actual call to arms brought a heartbreaking time to many homes. In some it actually parted father and son, or brother and brother. While it created no such chasm in the Lee's family, it brought to Robert E. Lee the bitterest and most trying decision of his whole life. Lee had loved his country. He had served her faithfully for 32 years. His actions, rather than his words, had proved his entire devotion. But the words, too, were not lacking, as references to his letters will show. One such glimpse of his heart is seen in a letter written from Texas in 1856. In telling his wife about his 4th of July celebration, he says, "Mine was spent after a march of 30 miles on one of the branches of the Brazos, under my blanket, elevated on 4 sticks driven into the ground as a sunshade. The sun was fiery hot, the atmosphere like a blast, from a hot air furnace. The water salt. Still my feelings for my country were as ardent, my faith in her future as true, and my hope for her advancement as unabated as they would have been under better circumstances. When finally the choice had to be made between state and nation, Lee was sore beset. He had no interest in the perpetuation of slavery. His views all tended the other way. In this enlightened age, he wrote, there are few, I believe, but will acknowledge that slavery as an institution is a moral and political evil. He had already set free his own slaves and was in favor of freeing all the slaves in the South. But when it came a question of deserting his own state, his beloved Virginia, the problem was far more difficult. All night nearly he paced his chamber, says Thomas Nelson Page, often seeking on his knees the guidance of the God he trusted in. But in the morning light had come. His wife's family were strongly Union in their sentiments, and the writer has heard that powerful family influences were exerted to prevail on him to adhere to the Union side. My husband has wept tears of blood, wrote Mrs. Lee to his old commander Scott, who did him justice to declare that he knew he acted under a compelling sense of duty. Lee had no illusions as to the sternness of the contest and the sacrifices that he with others would have to make. His own beautiful home lay just across the river from Washington. He must have seen with prophetic vision how it would be seized by the Federal government and held for other purposes, an act of confiscation that was only partially atoned for a half a century later. He also knew that Virginia, being a border state, would bear the brunt of the war. I can contemplate no greater calamity for the country than the dissolution of the Union, he wrote in January, and in April that dissolution came. Nor did the fortunes of war itself swerve him from the belief that in serving his state he was doing his highest duty. After it was over and he had gone into retirement of work in Washington College, we find him writing to General Beauregard as follows: I need not tell you that true patriotism sometimes requires men to act exactly contrary at one period to that which it does at another, and the motive which impels them, the desire to do right, is precisely the same. History is full of illustrations of this. Washington himself is an example. Here he invokes the example that had been his guiding star since early boyhood. He fought at one time against the French under Braddock, in the service of the King of Great Britain. At another he fought with the French at Yorktown, under orders of the Continental Congress against him. He has not been branded by the world with reproach for this, but his course has been applauded. While Lee was wrestling with his momentous decision, a further temptation was placed in his path, which he thrust aside. He was offered the high post of Commander in Chief of the Union forces. This offer came as a suggestion from Scott that Colonel Lee would be worth 50,000 troops to our side, and although Lincoln had never met him, he was glad to accede to the suggestion. Lee quietly remarked in declining the honor, I stated as candidly and as courteously as I could that, though opposed to secession and deprecating war, I could take no part in an invasion of the Southern States. Such was the manner of man who was soon chosen to lead the Confederate armies. Let us pause for the final picture of the man himself from a composite by men who knew him. In physique, Lee was every inch a man. He stood 5 feet 11 inches in height, weighed 175 pounds, and there was not an ounce of superfluous flesh on him. He was as fine looking a man as one would wish to see, said General Hunt, of perfect figure and strikingly handsome. General Meigs added, Lee was a man then in the vigor of youthful strength, with a noble and commanding presence, an admirable, graceful, and athletic figure. General Preston remarked that he had a countenance which beamed with gentleness and benevolence. J. S. Wise said, "I have seen all the great men of our times except Mr. Lincoln, and I have no hesitation in saying that Robert E. Lee was incomparably the greatest looking of them all." And Alexander H. Stephens, when he saw Lee for the first time and talked of the newly born Confederacy, was moved in his enthusiasm to say, as he stood there fresh and ruddy as a David from the sheepfold, in the prime of manly beauty and the embodiment of a line of heroic and patriotic fathers and worthy mothers, "It was thus I first saw Robert E. Lee. I had before me the most manly and entire gentleman I ever saw." Lee's fame as a general of the first rank has survived the overly enthusiastic eulogies of his friends and the first caustic comments of his foes. His strategy has come to be recognized as of the highest order. To begin with, he had to build his army from the ground up, but ended by having one of the most perfect fighting machines in the history of warfare. His men obeyed him with a devotion that was almost idolatrous. He suggested the uniform of quiet gray on account of its protective coloring and against all the army traditions of ages, that an army should march into action in gaudy and glittering attire. It was not until the great World War of a century later that wise military leaders followed his example and dressed their troops as inconspicuously as possible. It is not the province of this short sketch to trace General Lee's campaigns step by step to the final meeting with Grant at Appomattox. Army after army was sent to meet him from the North's far greater resources, only to be baffled or defeated in the South. And it was not until he forsook his successful tactics of the defensive and assumed the offensive on his invasion of Pennsylvania that he encountered serious defeat at Gettysburg. But after all, the great foe to whom his troops had finally to succumb was general starvation. The resources of the South were literally exhausted. "My men are starving," said Lee tersely to Grant, and back of them lay a suffering land that had literally been bled white. It was indeed a bitter lesson that the South had learned, but the verdict of history is that it was salutary. The Union was greater than any state or group of states. It had required a war to rectify that fatal flaw in the Constitution, but out of the fires of that terrible conflict was fused a Union strong and great, that should be far better fitted to withstand the shock of time. Since that bygone day when Lee laid aside his sword forever and his men went straggling back to their plowshares, America has been engaged in two other wars, and among the first to respond to the bugle call and line up behind Old Glory have been the sons and grandsons of that staunch line of gray, the men who followed Lee. If the souls of great soldiers ever come back to earth, we can imagine no finer picture than the leader of a lost cause again looking up to the stars and stripes and pledging it his silent allegiance. We can see him on his familiar gray charger at the head of his forces, fighting again for his beloved country. We can seem to hear his voice ringing in command: "On, men of Virginia, on, men of the South, we are Americans all." Important dates in Lee's life: 1807, January 19th, Robert Edward Lee born. 1825, entered West Point. 1829, graduated second in his class, made second lieutenant in engineers. 1831, married Mary Custis. 1838, appointed captain. 1845, joined General Scott's staff in Mexico. 1848, made colonel for gallant conduct. 1852, appointed superintendent of West Point. 1855, Appointed lieutenant colonel of cavalry in service against Indians. 1861. Made general in Confederate army. 1865. Surrendered to Grant. 1865. Accepted presidency of Washington College, Virginia. 1870. October 12th. Died at this college. End of Lee, Part 2. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas.
Section 7 of Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephanie Lee. Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers by J. Walker McSpadden. Napoleon, Part 1. Napoleon, the friendless boy who was to sway mighty armies. Hayseed, hayseed! Thus mocked a group of schoolboys of a mate who stood moodily by and glowered upon them. Although their words were not English, hayseed was what they meant by the punning French phrase. This boy from the South who did not speak as they did, or act as they did, and wore cheaper clothes, was the butt of their ridicule. He calls himself Napoleon, they said. He means Le Paillonnet, straw nose. And the way they rattled it off sounded like his name turned round. No wonder the Southerner glared. How this moody and unpopular schoolboy grew from childhood without intimate friends, without being understood, into a masterful leader of men is one of the strange puzzles of history. It totally upsets that other paradox: the child is father of the man, for there was little to indicate in the child Bonaparte, the man Napoleon. He was not even born on the land with which his name is forever associated, France. He first saw the light of day upon the Isle of Corsica, a rocky point in the blue waters of the Mediterranean, some 50 miles west of Italy. By treaty, this island passed from Genoese into French control in 1769, and it will always be a disputed question as to which flag Napoleon was born under. He always claimed the date of August 15th, 1769, as his natal day, which would make him nominally of French birth, but the boy Napoleon spoke Italian. Charles Bonaparte, the future emperor's father, was not a remarkable man, although he stood well in his home town of Ajaccio. He practiced law, and must have worked early and late trying to provide for his large family. His wife, Letitia, a woman of great personal beauty and force of character, was the mother of 13 children, Napoleon being the 4th. In a family of this size, it was a case of every fellow shift for himself, which rule Napoleon followed out with a vengeance. He himself said in later years, "I was self-willed and obstinate. Nothing awed me, nothing disconcerted me. I was quarrelsome, exasperating. I feared no one. I gave a blow here and a scratch there. Everyone was afraid of me. My brother Joseph was the one with whom I had the most to do. He was beaten, bitten, scolded. I complained that he did not get over it soon enough." His mother alone was able to manage him, but she had other things to do as well, so it is not strange that he escaped from the leash. He relates one amusing incident where he was caught red-handed. In the garden behind their house was a clump of fig trees, which Napoleon was fond of climbing. His mother forbade him to do so, both for fear of damage to himself and to the fruit, but the self-willed boy persisted. "One day when I was idle, and at a loss for something to do," he relates, "I took it in my head to long for some of those figs. They were ripe. No one saw me, or could know anything of the matter. I made my escape, ran to the tree, and gathered the whole. My appetite being satisfied, I was providing for the future by filling my pockets, when an unlucky gardener came in sight. I was half dead with fear, and remained fixed on the branch of the tree, where he had surprised me. He wished to seize me and take me to my mother. Despair made me eloquent. I represented my distress, promised to keep away from the figs in the future, and he seemed satisfied. I congratulated myself on having come off so well, and fancied that the adventure would never be known, but the traitor told all. The next day my mother wanted to go and gather some figs. I had not left any, there was none to be found. The gardener came, great reproaches followed, and an exposure. The upshot of it was a sound thrashing. But despite all the trials that the boy gave his mother, there always existed between them a strong affection. Napoleon never spoke of her in after years except in words of praise. "It is to my mother, to her good precepts and upright example, that I owe my success and any great thing I have accomplished." And again, "My mother was a superb woman, a woman of ability and courage." The boy's first regular schooling was obtained at a small village school kept by nuns. We have a picture of him there as a small thin boy with a shock of unruly hair, a face not always clean, and stockings half off. But how many other boys have been guilty of such conventional sins, only they do not get immortalized in the sober pages of history. He next went to a more advanced day school, and then to a seminary conducted by the Abbé Recco. While not a prize student, he was fond of geography, history, and mathematics, and even as a lad his wonderful memory for names and dates began to assert itself. He had what is known as a photographic mind. When once it had received an impression, the record was permanent. One other bent early asserted itself. It was for warlike scenes. The boy not only read greedily of Caesar and Alexander and other great conquerors of the past, he drew pictures on the walls, of regiments of soldiers, which in fancy he commanded. His brother Joseph would jeer, and then there was more trouble. Joseph generally got the worst of it both bodily and mentally. No sooner was the fight over than the conqueror made good his vantage. I went to complain before he had time to recover from his confusion. I had need to be on the alert. Our mother would have repressed my warlike humor. She would not have put up with my caprices. Her tenderness was allied with severity. She punished, rewarded, all alike. The good, the bad, nothing escaped her. My father, a man of sense, but too fond of pleasure to pay much attention to our infancy, sometimes attempted to excuse our faults. "Let them alone," she replied. "It is not your business. It is I who must look after them." The father, a man of happy-go-lucky disposition, would shrug his shoulders and laugh. But when it came to choosing a profession for the two boys, he did not hesitate. Joseph, the browbeaten, should become a priest, he said, while Napoleon must study soldiering, which decision suited at least one of the boys to a T. Napoleon was only 9 years old when this decision was made, but very precocious. He talked and reasoned like a boy 5 years older. His unruly disposition probably hastened the choice as well. His parents felt that a school where there was stern discipline would be the best thing for him. Accordingly his father obtained for him an appointment to one of the Royal Military Schools, and on April 23, 1779, he was formally enrolled at Brienne, France, as a student. The die was cast. He was to become a soldier. The next 5 years, however, were by no means a joyous period in his life. The first months he felt like a fish out of water. Nor did he try very hard to adapt himself to his environment. It was all frightfully strange and different. From the sunny island in the Mediterranean he found himself transported suddenly to the northern gloom of the Champagne region. The very language was different. He must unlearn Italian, and learn French. It always came hard to him. To the end of his days he never could spell correctly, although he did learn in time to express himself with clarity and precision. He found himself also thrown into contact with a group of youngsters who were by no means disposed to put up with his overbearing ways. Many of them were the sons of wealthy parents, while he at times was in straitened circumstances. They were fastidious in dress, while he had inclined to the slovenly. Small wonder that they derided him, or that he withdrew within the shell of his pride, and stayed there. He had no intimates. One schoolmate who perhaps came nearest to making a friend of this stand-offish chap from the South, and who was to enjoy a large measure of his confidence in after life, was Bourrienne. The latter wrote his famous Memoirs of Napoleon, which give us many interesting personal glimpses. Here is one of the earliest. At Brienne Bonaparte was remarkable for the dark color of his complexion, which the climate of France afterwards very much changed, as well as for his piercing and scrutinizing glance, and for the style of his conversation, both with his masters and companions. His conversation almost always gave one the idea of ill humor, and he was certainly not very sociable. This, I think, may be attributed to the misfortunes of his family during his childhood, and the impressions made on his mind by the subjugation of his country. It is interesting to note that at this time the boy was still far from reconciled to the idea of being French. He resented the fact that his father's sword, at one time, had helped to further the conquest of Corsica by France. It was to this fact, indeed, that Napoleon himself owed his appointment to this military college. But the boy does not let this consideration sway him. "I hope some time to be in a position to restore her freedom to Corsica," he exclaimed. Napoleon's isolation from his fellow cadets was not entirely to his disadvantage. Brienne possessed a good library, and here day after day the boy might be found poring over the stories of great exploits of the past, and dreaming his own daydreams. But his sword was not for France. He pictured himself as her conqueror. One of his favorite books was Plutarch's Lives of Illustrious Men. He devoured the Iliad and the Odyssey whole. "With my sword by my side, and Homer in my pocket, I hope to carve my way through the world," he wrote to his mother. Another well-thumbed volume was Caesar's Gallic Wars. We've read of more than one instance of ill will showing between Napoleon and a clique of aristocratic classmates, but we do not find that he was ever afraid of them, or that he ever acted the sneak or the coward. Morose he often was, and sullen, but it seemed born of the spirit of misunderstanding which still lurked within his breast, against the world at large. He had simply not found himself. One anecdote related of these school days reveals him as the potential leader, and shows that the other boys, despite their ridicule, recognized his ability. During one unusually severe winter a heavy fall of snow visited the school. Napoleon suggested that they build a fort, and drew up plans for a complete series of fortifications. The others fell in with his scheme, and upon its completion a battle royal ensued which lasted for several days, and put more than one of the participants in the hospital for repairs. In charge of one of the two armies, now attacking the fort, and now playing the part of its defenders, was Napoleon Bonaparte. He was in his element at last. By the time that he had completed his 5 years at Brienne, he was made commander of a company of cadets. His first official report card is worth reproducing. School of Brienne. State of the King's scholars eligible from their age to enter into the service or to pass to the school at Paris. To wit, Monsieur de Bonaparte, Napoleon, born the 15th August, 1769, in height 4 feet 10 inches, 10 lines, has finished his 4th season, of good constitution, health excellent, character submissive, honest and grateful, conduct very regular, has always distinguished himself by his application to mathematics, understands history and geography tolerably well, is indifferently skilled in merely ornamental studies and in Latin, in which he has only finished his 4th course, would make an excellent sailor, deserves to be passed on to the school at Paris. 2 points are especially interesting in this report. The first, that Napoleon had a submissive character. The second, that he would make an excellent sailor. The following year, when another inspector visited the school, he added a note that was more accurate. Character masterful, impetuous, and headstrong, and he decided that Napoleon should enter the military school at Paris. Accordingly, in the fall of 1784, he bade Brienne farewell without regrets on either side, and turned his face toward the capital. No one seeing this slender, almost dwarfed figure with a thin face, high cheekbones, and sunken, inquiring eyes, would ever have imagined that Paris was welcoming her future lord. History holds strange secrets within her pages. At the military school, he chose the artillery as his particular branch of service. To what good use he put his study of the field guns, we find evidence in his first appearance on the field of actual warfare. At the outset he made few friends. It seemed to be the bitter experience of Brienne all over again. The trouble was that he was one of the students being educated at the state's expense, a perfectly proper system, which we ourselves follow at West Point and Annapolis. But many of these French students came of wealthy families, and, like young prigs, looked down upon the king's scholars as charity patients. Napoleon justly resented this, and even went so far as to indite a memorial against this condition of affairs at Brienne, which did not tend to enhance his popularity. However, he did begin to find himself in a social way. With maturer years and a broader outlook, he began to emerge from his shell. He made a few good friends, 1 or 2 being among the gentler sex. One lady in particular, Madame de Colombier, took a fancy to this gawky country lad, and frequently invited him to her home in the country. Her daughter, Caroline, was also a welcome friend, and the memory of those simple but pleasant hours remained with him all his life as a ray of sunshine among the all too gloomy days of youth. "We were the most innocent creatures imaginable," he says. "We contrived little meetings together. I well remember one which took place on a midsummer morning, just as daylight was beginning to dawn. It will scarcely be believed that all our happiness consisted in eating cherries together." The young artillery student, now a lieutenant, also visited the Permons, and Madame Junot, then a little girl, gives a clever cartoon of him as he appeared in full regimentals at the age of 16. There was one part of his dress which had a very droll appearance. That was his boots. They were so high and wide that his thin little legs seemed buried in their amplitude. Young people are always ready to observe anything ridiculous, and as soon as my sister and I saw Napoleon enter the drawing-room, we burst into a loud fit of laughter. Bonaparte could not relish a joke, and when he found himself the object of merriment he grew angry. My sister, who was some years older than I, told him that since he wore a sword he ought to be gallant to ladies, and, instead of being angry, should be happy that they joked with him. "You are nothing but a child, a little schoolgirl," said Napoleon, in a tone of contempt. Cécile, who was 12 or 13 years of age, was highly indignant at being called a child, and she hastily resented the affront by replying to Bonaparte, "And you are nothing but a puss in boots." End of Napoleon, Part 1. Section 8 of Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Stephanie Lee. Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers by J. Walker McSpadden. Napoleon, Part 2. Napoleon at this time was hard put to it to keep up appearances as an officer on his slender income. His father had passed away, and he could not expect further help from home. He was now his mother's oldest adviser, and we find him writing her sage letters which sound like a man of 40. Indeed, his brain matured early. At 14 he wrote and spoke like a man. He was subject to fits of depression and melancholy, and even thoughts of suicide, but these, fortunately, were passing whims, and gradually the resolute nature he was to evince in later years began to assert itself. A favorite motto with him as a man was, "The truest wisdom is a resolute determination," and already he was putting it into practice. Soon after obtaining his commission, he left school on his first assignment of active duty. Some riots had broken out at Lyons, and his regiment of artillery was sent there. But things speedily quieted down, leaving to him the monotony of garrison life. In telling about it afterward he remarked, "When I entered the service I found garrison life tedious. I began reading novels, and that kind of reading proved interesting. I made an attempt at writing some. This task gave range to my imagination. It took hold of my knowledge of positive facts, and often I found amusement in giving myself up to dreams in order to test them later by the standard of my reasoning powers. I transported myself in thought to an ideal world, and I sought to discover wherein lay the precise difference between that and the world in which I lived." Thus we see in the young soldier the same recluse and dreamer of Brienne. In boyhood parlance today he "flocked by himself," building air castles which in part were to become reality. As for his early attempts at authorship, he tried his hand with indifferent success at fiction, essays, and history, but it is said that he destroyed all this work, with the exception of a fragment, Letters on the History of Corsica, which was to have told the story of his beloved island. He returned home on a visit not long after, to help his mother settle up the family estate. Her means were very meagre, and her family unusually large. In addition, his father's affairs had become involved. He had been advanced some money by the French government to plant mulberry trees, in connection with the silkworm industry, and a part of this advance was as yet unpaid. On the score of ill health Napoleon prolonged his stay at Ajaccio for some months, and did not rejoin his regiment until the spring of 1788. He stayed on the island to aid the family from his own pay, and to get a further advance on the mulberry grove, and also as a means of getting away from other people. He was a pronounced recluse, indulging in long rambles over the island, and finding his sole pleasure in authorship. Upon the very threshold of his public career he still appeared as the most unlikely object upon which fortune would bestow her favour. And as if there were not barriers enough to his success, he was still an alien in heart from France. He wore her uniform and served under her flag, but he was Corsican through and through, still resenting with a southern impetuosity the means by which the French had conquered Corsica. But unknown to him and many a wiser head, the hour of destiny was at hand. The dark days of the French Revolution were rapidly approaching, when it seemed as if the whole world would be engulfed in disaster. With the fateful year of 1789 the hour struck, and Napoleon was then just 20 years of age. On the first echoes of revolution which reached Corsica, Napoleon was on the alert. He thought he saw a golden opportunity to throw off the shackles of the conqueror. But one of the first acts of the National Assembly was to recognize the full rights of the island as a part of the state of France, and Napoleon, who had already made an attempt to organize a sort of home guard, felt himself disarmed. "France has opened her bosom to us," he said. "Henceforth we have the same interests and the same solicitudes. It is the sea alone which separates us." With but one lapse he became a loyal son of France henceforth. The Assembly builded stronger than it knew when it recognized Corsica. After the first mutterings of revolt France became comparatively quiet for nearly 2 years. Napoleon joined his regiment in 1791, and was promoted to first lieutenant, in the 4th Artillery, stationed at Valence. It was at this time that the ill-starred king, Louis XVI, tried to flee from the country, but was seized and held a prisoner. The National Assembly was in complete control, and Bonaparte with other officers of the army subscribed to a new oath of allegiance. It was by no means a compulsory act on his part, but in tune with his own active, impetuous spirit. He became secretary of a club called the Friends of the Constitution, and composed an address to the National Assembly. At the same time occurred an episode which reveals the duplicity of his nature, for Napoleon could be unscrupulous when he had his own ends to serve. Taking advantage of the general state of turmoil, he obtained another leave of absence, and returned to Corsica. There, although wearing the French uniform, he again fomented trouble against the authorities. He organized a company of Corsican volunteers, with which he was to make a bold stroke for liberty. But the movement failed ingloriously, and ended only by getting him into disrepute with both his government and his neighbors. He saw that his future safety and career lay with the army, so he deserted the popular cause. The Corsicans were so incensed that they declared him an outlaw and his family infamous. In June 1793 the Bonapartes removed from the island, and only a few short years found him its conqueror in the name of France. The last spark of his Corsican spirit was extinguished. Only the outbreak of war with Austria prevented the court-martial which the recreant officer deserved. Instead, such was France's need of trained men, that after a brief interval he was actually promoted to a captaincy. As he himself said, "The beginning of a revolution was a fine time for an enterprising young man." His first actual taste of warfare occurred at Toulon, where his regiment was now stationed. Many of the inhabitants of this southern port were royalists, and they sought to hold the city for the king. The Republican troops were ordered to capture the town, which they did after a lively siege and assault. The commander of artillery having been wounded, Napoleon was ordered to take his place. His skill, coolness, and bravery during this engagement are well attested. A soldier serving a gun near him was killed. At once Napoleon took his place at the gun, and served until relieved. Aiding the royalists in the harbour was a fleet of ships under the English and Spanish, and here it was that Napoleon was to strike his first blow at his lifelong antagonist, England. He submitted a plan for the bombardment of the fleet, and the capture of a fort which they had heavily fortified on shore, called, from its strength, the Little Gibraltar. As a result of a spirited attack at dawn, the shore batteries capitulated, and a few hours later the foreign ships sailed away in haste. Napoleon's superior officer, Dugommier, complimented him highly for his share in the attack, and mentioned him in the official dispatches to this effect: "Among those who distinguished themselves most, and who most aided me to rally the troops and push them forward, are citizens Bonaparte, commanding the artillery, Arena and Cerconi, adjutants general." As a direct result of this first taste of battle, he became, in February 1794, a general of brigade, with charge of the artillery and stores of the Army of Italy, as the Southern Expeditionary Forces were called. But his feet were by no means firmly fixed on the ladder of fortune. These were the days of the Reign of Terror, where no man's life or liberty was assured. At one time Napoleon was deprived of his command, and was in imminent danger of losing his head. He had incurred the suspicion of the tribunal, as had many other unfortunate, but he was finally pardoned, not because of any sentiment or justice, but because of the advantages which might be derived from his military information and knowledge of localities, for the service of the Republic. In the swift turn of events, it was not many months before this pardon of convenience was actually turned to the advantage of the Tribunal, and of Napoleon himself. A rival government called the Central Committee was set up, and the streets of Paris were in an uproar. Something had to be done, and done quickly. Revolutions rise or fall overnight. The command of Republican troops was entrusted to Paul Barras, and one of his staff officers was Napoleon Bonaparte. Barras had the foresight to bring up as many artillery as possible, as his men were few. Napoleon saw that these guns were placed so as to enfilade the principal streets. His experience at Toulon, as well as his natural genius for strategy, stood him in good stead. The whiff of grape shot which he fired on that October day in 1795 cleared the streets of the opposition, and likewise cleared the pathway for him leading eventually to a throne. The whole world knows of the later deeds of this slim figure who thus steps masterfully forward to the centre of the most troubled stage in Europe. Days of conflict and turmoil were yet to follow for Napoleon, but never days of uncertainty. He had found himself. In 6 short years the brooding misanthrope, the gawky young man who shunned his fellows, became the self-possessed leader of men, wielding a power of personal magnetism that was almost uncanny. At 26 his larger career may be said to have begun. This slight boyish figure takes command of the army of Italy, and leads that memorable campaign to the conquest of Italy before he was 30. Promptly nicknamed the Little Corporal by his army, the term was speedily turned from one of derision to positive affection. Napoleon himself accepted it as a compliment. He learned to understand his men, to fraternize with them, to bring out the best that was in them. This was one of the chief secrets of his marvelous career. He was an able strategist, a skilled diplomatist, a man of vision and cunning. But despite all these and other high qualities, he would have fallen short of success if he had not possessed his ability to read and to sway the hearts of men. Whence came this power to one who had been a lonely and derided boy? It was as though a magician's wand had touched him overnight. We have space to give only one picture from the crowded panorama of this world conqueror, emperor, and exile. It will serve to show the powerful magnetism of his personality, perhaps serve to explain in some slight degree the magic of the mere name of Napoleon, throughout the ranks of his armies. Napoleon the mighty had fallen. He had been sent into exile on the Isle of Elba, but had escaped, and now with a little army of 1,000 men was marching boldly north to reconquer France. The news spread rapidly, and the king now on the throne sent Marshal Ney, a former general under Napoleon, to capture him. Ney promised his king to bring the fallen leader bound into his presence, and, determined to make his promise good, set forth on the road to Marseilles. It was a grey day in early spring. The sky looked forbidding, and a chill of winter was in the air. As the king's army moved forward they descried in the distance a smaller band approaching. At its head rode a familiar figure, the Little Corporal, with shoulders stooped, as though bending toward his horse's mane. He gave no orders to his men, who marched forward uncertainly. As the distance narrowed down to a matter of yards, Napoleon seemed for the first time to note the presence of the opposing troops. He saw at a glance that many of the men now confronting him had formerly followed him. Dismounting, he walked rapidly towards them, tore open his great coat, and offered his breast to their rifles. "Who among you would fire upon his emperor?" he cried. Instantly the army, officers, and men lowered their weapons and tossed their caps high in air. "Vive l'Empereur!" they shouted, and placed him at their head. They turned and marched back upon Paris. Important dates in Napoleon's life. 1769, August 15th. Napoleon Bonaparte born. 1779. Entered school at Brienne. 1784. Entered military school at Paris. 1786. Became junior lieutenant. 1791. Made lieutenant. 1792. Made captain. 1794. Made general of brigade for services against English at Toulon. 1795. Cleared the streets of Paris with his artillery, and was appointed to command of Army of Italy. 1796. Married Josephine de Beauharnais. 1797. Completed conquest of Italy. 1798. Egyptian campaign. 1799. Made first consul of France. 1804. Crowned emperor. 1807. won Battle of Austerlitz. 1813 Russian campaign. 1814 abdicated the throne and was sent to Elba. 1815 returned to France. 1815 defeated at Waterloo and sent to St. Helena. 1821 May 5th died at St. Helena. End of Napoleon, Part 2.
Section 9 of Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers by J. Walker McSpadden. Wellington, Part 1. Wellington, Iron Duke. Of all the curious parallels of history, none is stranger than that of Napoleon and Wellington, who were to meet as rivals on the fatal field of Waterloo. They were born in the same year, 1769, and in each case the exact date is somewhat uncertain. Wellington in later life always celebrated the 1st of May, but was not sure that it was his rightful birthday. Both were born upon islands, the one in Corsica, the other in Ireland, which islands, by the way, were constantly striving to achieve their independence. Both were born into large families. Napoleon was a fourth child, and Wellington a fourth son. The father of each is described as an easy-going, indulgent man, without force of character, while the mother was the moving genius of the family. Between Napoleon and his mother existed a lively affection, while Wellington's mother never seemed to care for this child, and constantly spoke of him in terms of reproach. Both boys attended military schools in France, far from their own homes and friends, and consequently drew apart from their comrades, lived their own lives, and carved out their own destinies. These are but a few of the very early parallels of two famous soldiers who were afterward to decide the fate of Europe at the points of their swords. The family name of Wellington, before he received a dukedom, was Wellesley or Wellesley. As a boy he was known as Arthur Wellesley. His father was the Earl of Mornington, his mother a daughter of Lord Dungannon. The Earl is spoken of as a lover and composer of music. Arthur had three brothers who were all destined to do noteworthy things. His oldest brother, who bore the title of Lord Wellesley, aided him no little in choosing his profession of soldier. The boy's birthplace was Dangon Castle, Dublin. Almost nothing is known as to his earlier years, beyond the sorrowful fact that his mother was not fond of him, almost had an aversion to him, and spoke of him openly as the fool of the family. From this we infer that Arthur was a silent, reserved lad who did not shine at his studies, but who nevertheless did a heap of thinking. Being misunderstood at home, he withdrew more and more into his shell, thus forming a crust of reserve which was to be more or less a handicap to him all through life. For the Iron Duke, as he came to be called, never threw off his diffidence, nor won the hearts of his soldiers, as did that other recluse, Bonaparte. Arthur Wellesley's first school away from home was Eton, the great prep school of so many English boys. The fact that he attended there helped to give rise to the proverb that Waterloo was won on the cricket fields of Eton. But as a matter of record, the boy was not interested in this sport. He preferred the fiddle to the racket, as he had inherited his father's love of music. "I was a player of the violin once myself, sir," he remarked in after years to a friend. "But I soon found that fiddling and soldiering didn't agree, so I gave it up, sir. I gave it up." Only one other anecdote is recorded of his life at Eton, and this was a fight. nor was it a case of choose your weapons. It was plain fists. He began with first principles. A fellow student, Robert Smith, who is chiefly noted as having been the brother of Sidney Smith, the noted essayist and preacher, was enjoying a swim in the river near the campus. Arthur could not resist the impulse to throw mud at his bare back. "Stop that!" yelled Smith. "You make me," taunted Wellesley. "You just wait till I come out," replied his victim. "Dare you to come," said Arthur. Bob promptly waded out, and they mixed. Just which boy got the better of it is not clear, but if justice ruled, the future conqueror of Napoleon should have received his first trouncing. One other fight is recorded of his early school days, and this does not mean that Arthur was naturally of a pugnacious disposition, for he wasn't. It simply means that one's battles, little or big, are always remembered, rather than the pleasant though colorless ways of peace. On a visit home, he got into an argument with a blacksmith's boy named Hughes. In this instant, might was right. The smith's muscles were brawnier, and the Etonian got soundly licked. That is, if we can take the word of Hughes, who was wont to boast in later years that he beat the man who beat Napoleon. At Eton came the usual question which confronts every boy in his teens, the choice of a business or profession. His mother did not think he was good for anything. In writing of her children about this time she says, "They are all, I think, endowed with excellent abilities, except Arthur, and he would probably not be wanting, if only there was more energy in his nature. But he is so wanting in this respect that I really do not know what to do with him." He took no interest in the law or the church. He seems to have moped along in a lackadaisical sort of way in the classroom. He had not given an indication of shining in any direction. Consequently, there was nothing left for a gentleman's son except the army. It was a makeshift choice. Those were the days of the American Revolution. The progress of this struggle must have appealed powerfully to the English boys, and the final defeat of the trained British troops by the raw colonials must have been a bitter blow. There came an insistent demand for more and better schools for the officers. England seems to have been poorly equipped in this respect. Wellesley himself, like many another English boy, was sent across the Channel to France. The chosen school was at Angers on the Main, and was conducted by the Marquis of Pignerol, a celebrated military engineer of the time. In connection with the school was a fine riding academy. It was in 1785 that Arthur entered this school. He was then 16, a thin, gangly-looking boy, who, perhaps because he had grown too rapidly, could not be persuaded to take much interest in anything. He felt out of his element and ill at ease, although he was not the only English lad here. He is described by General Mackenzie, who was a schoolmate, as not very attentive to his studies, and constantly occupied with a little terrier called Vic, which followed him everywhere. This is about as definite a glimpse of him as we can get, but it does enable us to picture him as idling about the streets of this picturesque old town, of climbing the steep cliffs which rise from the water's edge at the confluence of the streams which flow by Angers. At the top of the hill we can see him whistling to Vic, and tossing down one of the gentler slopes a stone or a stick for the faithful terrier to retrieve. Did this idle schoolboy dream dreams of future greatness on the battlefields of the land that was now teaching him to draw the sword? Who shall say? Although at Angers only a short time, about 12 months, it was by no means time wasted. He perfected his French and learned many things about manners and customs that were to be of good service. Likewise, through his family's influence, he made the acquaintance of several French noblemen, who must undoubtedly have given him a broader point of view, and perchance some good advice on the subject of soldiering. His father had died in 1781, but his older brother, who had made his mark as a soldier and man of letters, took a lively interest in him and constantly urged him on. England is indebted no little to this brother Richard, who probably more than any other was the guiding star in the making of her great soldier. In the days just after the American War, the British Army was not well organized or officered. Instead of the fighting machine that it afterward became, it was sort of a gentleman's training school, so far as the officers were concerned. Anyone who had good family connections or money could get a commission. The skill and experience were supposed to come later, on the field of action. This fact explains the early promotion of Arthur Wellesley. At the age of 17, soon after leaving Angers, he was made an ensign in a regiment of infantry, and within 5 years, by the time he was 22, he had been made a captain. Nor did his rapid advancement end here. In 1793 he became a major, then a lieutenant colonel, and then by 1796 he was a full-fledged colonel at 27. The secret power at court was his brother Richard, who was secretary to Pitt, the statesman. But another friend was Lord Westmoreland, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, who took a fancy to him and made him a staff officer. One historian puts it regarding army commissions: wealth and interest were nearly all powerful. It was the palmy day of purchase which George III had tried and failed to abolish, and until the Duke of York became commander-in-chief, infants of both sexes figured in the army lists as holders of commissions. It is interesting to note, to resume our parallel, that this was the stormy time of the French Revolution, when Napoleon was painfully carving his way upward by the edge of the sword, and by push rather than pull had achieved high command in early life. But we would do the young Wellington a grave injustice if we pictured him as leading a life of inactivity, awaiting a promotion through pull. He had qualities which now began to assert themselves and were to contribute to his larger fame. For one thing, he was something of a diplomat. He remembered names and faces, and turned every acquaintance to account. Later he was credited with a marvelous memory, such as also had his great French rival. These qualities, it is true, were slow in ripening. At the age of 21 he was elected to the Irish House of Commons from his home county. This was done in order to give him parliamentary training, and such service was allowed without the necessity of relinquishing his military rank or duties. It was merely an extra tail to his kite. He is thus described by a colleague, Sir Jonah Barrington: Wellesley was then ruddy-faced and juvenile in appearance, and popular enough among the young men of his age and station. His address was unpolished. He occasionally spoke in Parliament, but not successfully, and never on important subjects, and evinced no promise of that unparalleled celebrity and splendor which he has since reached, and whereto intrepidity and decision, good luck, and great military science have justly combined to elevate him. Although he made no great mark as a parliamentarian, he did make friends at this time who were destined to influence his life. One was the brilliant, though somewhat unprincipled, Lord Castlereagh, who was to aid him to obtain the chief military command of the English army in Spain. Another was a certain young lady, Charlotte Packenham, who found his tongue more eloquent than did his colleagues in the House of Commons. She was the daughter of Lord Longford, who was not so easily won over to the young man's suit. In fact, the nobleman gave him a curt no. He was looking for a more brilliant match for his daughter than a subaltern. So the young people had to give each other a sad farewell. But it was not to be forever. 10 years later, when the young soldier had won his spurs and had returned from his brilliant campaign in India, a major general, the parental gates were unbarred. The Lady Charlotte had remained constant through all the years of waiting and separation, and they were happily wedded. End of Wellington, Part 1. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. Section 10 of Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers by J. Walker McSpadden. Wellington, Part 2. That Wellesley took more than a perfunctory interest in his military duties is evident even during his earliest years of service. For example, he wished to determine for himself just how much weight in the way of equipment a soldier could carry in light marching order. "I wished," he says, "to have some measure of the power of the individual man compared with the weight he was to carry, and the work he was expected to do. I was not so young as not to know that since I had undertaken a profession I had better endeavor to understand it." And he adds, "It must always be kept in mind that the power of the greatest armies depends upon what the individual soldier is capable of doing and bearing. It is but another way of saying a chain is no stronger than its weakest link, or as we put it today, it depends upon the man behind the gun." Thus Wellington early discovered and put into practice the indefinable something we call morale. As a lieutenant colonel of the 33rd Foot, he took up his work in earnest, with the result that in a few months it was officially declared the best drilled regiment in Ireland. But the young commander was not content with this. He did not want to remain at home as a mere drill sergeant when affairs were so active abroad. Due partly to the outbreak of the French Revolution, all Europe seethed with war. France was in revolt against the world, and all the neighboring powers were pitted against her. England had maintained a strict neutrality at first, but when Belgium was overrun, felt compelled to intervene, just as in the similar great war of aggression begun by Germany in our own time. Naturally, young Wellesley wanted to be in it. He wrote to his brother Richard, importuning him to use his influence in this direction. "I will serve as a major to one of the flank corps," he wrote, as his own regiment was the last for service. The request was not granted, however, and he had to wait until spring of 1794 for his chance to see active service. It was a parlous time to go over. The French had defeated one army after another of the Allies, and were in the heyday of their first success. The trouble seemed to be lack of unity of command and lack of able leadership. The Duke of York was in command of the British army, but allowed himself to be outmaneuvered repeatedly. By the fall of that year, when Wellesley was with the army, the campaign resembled a rout. During a series of rearguard actions in the retreat through Holland and Flanders, Colonel Wellesley came first into official notice. It was at Meuse, a stream made forever memorable in the recent Great War. A retreat had been ordered during the night to avoid a superior force of French. One regiment, however, had mistaken its orders and engaged the enemy. The result was a hopeless tangle of infantry and cavalry, with the enemy taking advantage of the confusion to press the attack. The 33rd had been ordered to support the rear. Colonel Wellesley, seeing the danger, ordered his regiment to halt in a field alongside of the road, leaving the way clear for the retreat. As soon as the stragglers had gotten by, he threw his regiment again in solid formation across the road, and they advanced upon the charging French with such coolness and precision that the attackers were forced to halt. It was only an incident of warfare, but it showed his promptness of decision and the fruits of discipline in his regiment. All that ensuing winter the French harried their army. Wellesley was stationed on the Waal, a branch of the Rhine, and he gives some idea of their arduous life in a letter dated December 20th, 1794. At present the French keep us in a perpetual state of alarm. We turn out once, sometimes twice every night. The officers and men are harassed to death, and if we are not relieved, I believe there will be very few of the latter remaining shortly. I have not had the clothes off my back for a long time, and generally spend the greatest part of the night upon the bank of the river, notwithstanding which I have entirely got rid of that disorder which was nearly killing me at the close of the summer campaign. Although the French annoy us much at night, they are very entertaining during the daytime. They are perpetually chatting with our officers and soldiers, and dance the carmagnole upon the opposite bank whenever we desire them. But occasionally the spectators on our side are interrupted in the middle of a dance by a cannon ball from theirs. In this somewhat humorous recital, Wellesley makes no mention of the suffering which they must have undergone for lack of food and supplies of all kinds. He purposely puts the best face on it, and bears his troubles stoically. But young as he was, he marveled at the inefficiency and lack of coordination of the high command. Once, when a dispatch was received by the general during dinner from their ally Austria, he tossed it aside unopened with the remark, "That will keep till morning." During 3 months on the Waal, Wellesley declared that he was in direct touch with headquarters only once, and adds, "We had letters from England, and I declare that those letters told us more of what was passing at headquarters than we learnt from headquarters ourselves. It has always been a marvel to me how any of us escaped." One result, nevertheless, of this isolation was to throw the young colonel back upon his own resources. It was the finest possible training for his later career. When Colonel Wellesley returned to England the next year, he thought for a time of resigning his command. One reason was undoubtedly the poor state of the army in equipment and discipline. Another was the fact that he owed his brother money on account of promotions in the service, and his officer's pay was not enough to repay it. He was always scrupulous in matters of debt. His application for discharge, however, was not accepted. England had need of all her trained men at this time. In addition to the trouble in France, there were other affairs demanding attention in Spain and India. The whole world seemed to need readjusting at once. Wellesley's next assignment was to accompany an expedition against the French settlement in the West Indies, which set sail in October, 1795. But when only 2 days out, the ships encountered a terrible storm. One ship sank with all on board, others were badly crippled, and hundreds of sailors perished. The expedition put back to England. Although Wellesley escaped the full effects of this storm, the exposure left his health undermined. His regiment was ordered abroad in the spring, this time to the East Indies, and when they set sail in April, he was too ill to accompany them. It was not until February 1797 that he joined them in Calcutta. Arthur Wellesley was now in his 28th year. All that had passed hitherto might be regarded as his schooling. He had been an obscure and foolish boy at school, to all appearance. He had failed to make his mark as a military student on the Main. He had been a dilettante staff officer and a resident member of Parliament. Money and family had apparently made him what he was, neither better nor worse than many another young British officer. In his brief campaign in France he had conducted himself creditably, but had come away with a distaste for the service as it was then conducted. To revert to our former parallel, Napoleon at 28 was on the high road to world mastery. Wellington at 28 had not yet found himself, but now on his trip to India he was on the threshold of his career. His deeds there and on other fields were to astonish the world. Did they also astonish the silent officer himself? It would require a detailed account of the Indian campaign to trace adequately the gradual rise of this officer in the service, for his was not a meteoric or spectacular rise. It was by gradual steps, but each step found him fully prepared. This, perhaps, is as near the secret of the great soldier's success as we can get. He was never a self-advertiser. He never talked much, but he was keenly observant, and his wonderfully retentive memory aided him at every turn. He could go through a countryside once, and then be able to map out an attack, using every natural advantage to its utmost. And best of all, his superiors were beginning to discover his merits. They soon found beneath his quiet exterior a keen intellect and an indomitable will. Within 2 months after reaching Calcutta, he was consulted by General St. Leger on a plan to establish artillery bases, and was also nominated to command an expedition against the Philippines, then under Spanish control. But he preferred to remain and fight it out in India. "I am determined that nothing shall induce me to desire to quit this country until its tranquillity is ensured," he said, which recalls to mind the famous saying of Grant's, "We will fight it out along this line if it takes all summer." Wellesley's next appointment was as commander of the Mysore Brigade. His brother Richard, Marquis of Wellesley, had been appointed Governor-General of India, and the two men were destined to exercise a strong influence on affairs in that disturbed country. While nominally in control of the land, the English possessions actually included only the narrow strip running along the various sea-coasts, the interior being overrun by unruly tribes of sepoys under Tipu Sahib. It required careful planning and equipping of armies marching from opposite sides of India to meet and crush this formidable rebellion. In all this strenuous work of field and garrison, Wellesley took an active part. At one time as governor of Seringapatam, at another as brigadier general, personally directing assaults upon some native fortress, and after its capture restoring order and discipline, and thus ensuring the respect and confidence of the natives. "I have been like a man who fights with one hand and defends himself with the other," he wrote at this period. "I have made some terrible marches, but I have been remarkably fortunate, first in stopping the enemy when they intended to press to the southward, and afterward, by a rapid march to the northward, in stopping Sindhia." In 1803 he was made Major General, with the title of Sir Arthur Wellesley, and 2 years later returned to England as one of her most trusted and esteemed commanders. And England had need of just such men as he. There was still more stirring years ahead in Spain and elsewhere, until this strong, silent man had emerged into the Iron Duke of Wellington, who should meet that other man of destiny on the plain of Waterloo. Wellington won his success by his infinite capacity for taking pains. His life defies the biographer to analyze, whether through the medium of a lengthy volume or a brief chapter, because it was made up of so many little things. There were the duties of each day, but he not only did them thoroughly, he also learned through them the larger grasp of the next day's problems. A contemporary pen picture of the Sepoy general on his return to England in 1805 will serve to show us what manner of man he appeared to be to his subordinates. Captain Shearer, who has left this portrait, says: General Wellesley was a little above the middle height, well-limbed and muscular, with little encumbrance of flesh beyond that which gives shape and manliness to the outline of the figure, with a firm tread, an erect carriage, a countenance strongly patrician, both in feature, profile, and expression, and an appearance remarkable and distinguished. Few could approach him on any duty or on any subject requiring his serious attention without being sensible of a something strange and penetrating in his clear, light eye. Nothing could be more simple and straightforward than the matter of what he uttered, nor did he ever in his life affect any peculiarity of pomp of manner, or rise to any coarse, weak loudness in his tone of voice. It was not so that he gave expression to excited feeling. His reputation as a great soldier will stand for all time, not because he defeated Napoleon, but because his whole military career was built upon duty. It was not ostentation, but merit that won him the supreme command. His ideals were always high. We must get the upper hand, he advised, and if once we have that, we shall keep it with ease, and shall certainly succeed. Important dates in Wellington's life. 1769, May 1st, Arthur Wellesley born. 1785, attended military school at Angers, France. 1787, entered British Army as ensign. 1793, became lieutenant colonel. 1794, saw his first active service in Flanders. 1796, colonel, sent to India. 1803, major general. 1805, married Charlotte Packenham. 1808, made lieutenant general and sent to command Peninsular War. 1814, created Duke of Wellington. 1815, defeated Napoleon at Waterloo. 1827, Prime Minister. 1852, September 14th, died. End of Wellington, Part 2. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas.
Section 11 of Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by HearHis.com. Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers by J. Walker McSpadden. Gordon, Part 1. Gordon, the man who discovered China. The name Gordon brings in mind the warrior, perchance the Highland laddie who with bagpipes fiercely blowing charges down the rocky slope against the enemy. Chinese Gordon, as one of this warlike clan will be known for all time, came indeed of a race of warriors, and was born in martial surroundings. But the man himself was far from being of that stern stuff that glories in a fight. As boy and man, he was quiet, lovable, and of intensely religious nature. Gordon means spear, and the name was probably given to the clan several centuries ago. Its members had always been famous in battle. Chinese Gordon's great-grandfather led a very eventful life. He was taken prisoner in the Battle of Prestopans, and later went to Canada on the special expedition which wrested that dominion from the French. His son took part in many battles, and served with distinction. The next in line, the father of Chinese Gordon, was Lieutenant General Henry William Gordon, a soldier of the highest type. General Gordon lived at Woolwich, long noted for its arsenal. It was only 9 miles out from St. Paul's, and is an object of interest at any time, but in times of war it fairly bristles with activity. Small wonder, then, that a boy coming from such a line of ancestors and born almost in a gun carriage should have chosen to become a soldier. With any other environment, Chinese Gordon would have become a preacher. Of course, the name Chinese was not the way he was christened. Charles George are his baptismal names, but few people know that fact now. He was the youngest child in a large family, 5 sons and 6 daughters. This calls to mind other large families from which sprang famous soldiers. Napoleon, for example. Charles was born in 1833, after his father had reached middle age, and had settled down in the piping times of peace. The elder Gordon had won his spurs in the Napoleonic Wars. We know very little of the boyhood of Charles Gordon, beyond the fact that during the first 10 years of his life he lived at the Pigeon House Fort in Dublin Bay, next to the Fort of Leith, and later on the island of Corfu. All of these places are spots of great natural beauty, a vista of stretching sea or mountain top, which the frowning fortress only aided in romance and charm. Many a long ramble must the boy have had, storing his memory with these quiet, sylvan pictures. Not far from Leith was the famous battlefield of Presponpans, where, nearly a century before, his great-grandfather had been taken prisoner. From his father or brothers he must have heard many a wild tale of the Highlanders and their exploits. As a child, however, this did not appeal to him. He loved nature in her quiet moods best. He was timid and nervous, to such an extent that the firing off of the cannon, when the colors were lowered at sundown, would make him jump half out of his boots. It was only by the sternest sort of self-control that he obtained the mastery of himself. Not that Charles Gordon was ever a coward. Morally, he was ever unflinching. He abhorred a lie, and was always ready to stand up for his convictions. But his physical frame was made of weaker stuff, much to his own vexation. One of the few early stories related of him is that he had difficulty in learning to swim. He could not get the stroke, and he had a horror of being in water over his head. So he made a practice of deliberately throwing himself into deep water, when out with his mates, knowing that it was sink or swim, or a case of being pulled out. He was then only 9. A few years later, another instance reveals his determination. A great circus was advertised in London, a novelty in those days, and the Gordon boys had been promised the treat. But just before its arrival, Charles fell into disgrace. He was charged with some sort of fault which he did not think should have been laid to his door. Later he was forgiven, and told that he might attend the circus, but his pride was aroused, and he refused to go. When he was 10, the first definite step toward making him a soldier was taken, for, of course, being a Gordon, he must be a soldier. He was sent to school at Troughton, preparatory to entering, as a cadet, the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich. At that time its commandant was a veteran of Waterloo, a peppery old chap who had left one of his legs on the soil of France as a souvenir. He was a martinet as to discipline, and Charles, who had become accustomed to doing a good deal of thinking for himself, came into frequent clashes with him. One day the old man said, "Gordon, I'm tired of fooling with you. You are incompetent. You will never make an officer." The young cadet, a boy of 16, gave him look for look, without quailing. Then, by way of reply, tore his epaulets from his shoulders, turned on his heel, and strode out of the room. Naturally, the guard-house was next in order, where the culprit could cool his heels and meditate upon the sinfulness of superior officers. In this particular case he seems to have blamed it upon the missing leg, for he remarked, long afterwards, "Never employ anyone minus a limb to be in authority over boys. They are apt to be irritable and unjust." He remained in the military academy 4 years. having been put back 6 months by way of discipline, and left it without any regrets. At this time, indeed, he had a positive distaste for the army. It was all drill and monotony. One day was too much like the other. What was the good of it all? Why did men have to learn to kill each other anyhow? Were we not put on earth for a higher mission? Thus reasoned the young man, who all his life was subject to moods of introspection and intense religious thought. Surely strange material out of which to build a soldier. He sensed this fact himself, and was not at all anxious to enter the army, and frequently in later life expressed a lively dissatisfaction for the service. He was an exemplification of the poet's line, "I feel two natures struggling within me." When he entered the service, as a second lieutenant of the engineers, at the age of 19, there was little to attract one in the army life. The long peace of Europe, which had followed the defeat of Napoleon, seemed likely to last forever. Except for a relatively small outbreak in France in 1848, all Europe was quiet. Consequently, the army held little attraction to an active young man. It was all drill and the petty details of garrison life. But underneath the placid surface, the political pot of Europe was really boiling furiously, only waiting a chance to bubble over. That chance soon came. Gordon's first assignment was to Pembroke, where plans were required for the forts at Milford Haven. Here, with other engineers, he worked for a few months, when he was ordered to the island of Corfu. This was not altogether to his liking. He had spent a part of his boyhood there in the Ionian Islands, but felt that they were off the map, so far as real activity was concerned. Then the bubbling pot at last boiled over. Russia, impatient of bounds, had begun her march southward, past the Black Sea, and toward the coveted lands of Turkey. The balance of power, that precarious something that has always kept Europe on edge, and particularly in the Balkans, was upset. Whether England wanted to or not, she must get into the breach. Thus began the Crimean War, a desperate struggle that was to bear some glorious pages in England's history, and some dark ones as well. It was to see the charge of the Light Brigade, splendid in itself, but brought about because someone had blundered. It was to produce a Florence Nightingale, but also the hideous sufferings which she helped to assuage. For England was unprepared. Her years of idleness had broken down her military organization. Splendid fighting men she still had, but the fighting machine itself was rusty. Young Gordon, perhaps through his father's influence, obtained a transfer from Corfu to the Crimea. The father did not much like his new billet. He may have sensed something of what was coming, but he did not fear for his son. "Get him into real action, I say," he would remark. "That will show whether there's any stuff in him. I guess there is," he added grimly, thinking of Charles's troubles in college. "All the time he was in the academy, I felt like I was sitting on a powder barrel." In mid-December of 1854, Gordon set sail from England on his first real job as a soldier. He was going with the task of building some wooden huts for the soldiers, and lumber was being shipped at the same time. But the soldiers for whom these shelters were intended were even then dying from exposure on the plains of Sebastopol. It was the first lesson of unpreparedness. Of this, however, the young engineer was then ignorant. He was in high spirits over the prospect of action and seeing the world. He arrived at Marseilles very tired, as he writes to his mother, but not too tired to give her a detailed description of what he has seen thus far. "The pretty towns and villages, vineyards and rivers, with glimpses of snowy mountains beyond." On New Year's Day he reached his destination, Balaklava. It was the depth of winter, and disaster stared the British in the face. The Russians were having the best of it. They were out-generaling the enemy at every turn. The British could do little more than dig in and hang on, with the bulldog stubbornness which has always marked them. At first the young lieutenant heard little of this. His duties as construction engineer kept him busy 6 miles back of the battle line. "I have not yet been to Sebastopol," he writes on January 3rd, "and do not hear anything of the siege. We hear a gun now and then. No one seems to interest himself about the siege, but all appear to be engaged in foraging for grub." 2 days later he writes, "We have only put up 2 huts as yet, but hope to do better soon." The army was suffering from both cold and hunger, and was in pitiable plight. Again he writes, "Lieutenant Dront, 9th Regiment, and another officer of some 16th Regiment were frozen to death last night, and 2 officers of the 93rd Regiment were smothered by charcoal. The streets of Balaklava are a sight, with swell English cavalry and horse artillery carrying rations, and officers in every conceivable costume foraging for edibles." There was little military glamour in such sights as this. No wonder young Gordon felt sick of it all. But he never gave the slightest indication of quitting. He only worked all the harder to help do his bit. As spring advanced, he had an opportunity to work closer to the lines. He received orders to construct trenches and rifle pits, which at times was extremely hazardous and brought him under fire. On one occasion a Russian bullet missed his head by a scant inch. At last, in the month of June, came his first chance to do some real fighting. Every branch of the service was marshalled by the commanding general, Lord Raglan, for a massed attack. What happened can be best described in Gordon's own words. "About 3 a.m. the French advanced on the Malakoff Tower in 3 columns, and 10 minutes after this our signal was given. The Russians then opened with a fire of grape that was terrific." And again, "They mowed down our men in dozens, and the trenches, being confined, were crowded with men who foolishly kept in them instead of rushing over the parapet, and, by coming forward in a mass, trusting to some of them at least being able to pass through untouched to the Redan, where, of course, once they arrived, the artillery could not reach them, and every yard nearer would have diminished the effect of the grape by giving it less space for spreading. We could thus have moved up the supports and carried the place. Unfortunately, however, our men dribbled out the ends of the trenches, 10 and 20 at a time, and as soon as they appeared, they were cleared away." Thus ended the first engagement in which Gordon took part. The Allies suffered defeat, and Lord Raglan died a few days later of a broken heart. It was not an auspicious baptism of fire. In August another assault was made, which also met defeat. Gordon ends his account with the remark, "We should have carried everything before us, if the men had only advanced." Perchance one reason why the men failed to advance was that their morale had been lowered by reason of the privations they had undergone. This was before the days of the Red Cross, the army canteen, or the YMCA with its homely comfort. The men had had to shift for themselves. Nursing the sick and wounded was almost unknown until the white-clad figure of Florence Nightingale showed the world its dereliction. Listen to what this devoted pioneer among nurses has to say. "Fancy working 5 nights out of the 7 in the trenches. Fancy being 36 hours in them at a stretch, as they sometimes were, lying down, or half lying down, often 48 hours with no food but raw salt pork, sprinkled with sugar, rum, and a biscuit. Nothing hot, because the exhausted soldier could not collect his own fuel, as he was expected to do, to cook his own rations. And fancy, through all this, the army preserving their courage and patience as they have done, and being now eager, the old ones as well as the young ones, to be led into the trenches. There was something sublime in the spectacle." Sublime, granted, but no soldier fights well on an empty stomach. Despite their hardships and reverses, however, the Allies were at last successful in the capture of Sebastopol. but it was a barren victory, as the Russians had set fire to the town and destroyed practically everything of value. The war soon afterwards ceased, and with it the first hard lesson in Charles Gordon's military training. He had entered it a somewhat careless youth. He came out of it a seasoned veteran. That his government had learned to appreciate his services is shown by the fact that he was soon afterward placed on a joint commission of the English, French, Russians, and Austrians to lay down a boundary line between Russia and her neighbors at the southwest. It was only one of many later attempts to define the Balkans. "The newly ceded territory is in great disorder," writes Gordon. "The inhabitants refuse to obey the Maldives and own nobody's authority. This is caused, I suspect, by Russian intrigues." Already cracks were beginning to show in the new boundary wall. End of Gordon, Part 11. Recorded by HearHis.com. Section 12 of Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by HearHis.com. Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers by J. Walker McSpadden. Gordon, Part 2. After 3 years of steady but interesting work following up the ravages of war, Gordon returned home. It was a rest well earned, and likewise needed, for there were still more strenuous days ahead. Then back he went, in the spring of 1858, to complete his work in the Caucasus. "I am pretty tired of my post as peacemaker," he writes, "for which I am naturally not well adapted. I am quite in the dark as how my mission has been fulfilled, but it is really immaterial to me, for I will not accept other work of such an anomalous character." The other work that was being stored up for him was of quite different nature. He might have called it anomalous, but it was to tax and bring out every resource in him. China, that land of distance and mystery, was undergoing a period of upheaval. A usurper had tried to seize the reins of government, and the French and British ships had been attacked. The British sent a force of reprisal, somewhat like that sent against the Boxer Rebellion in recent years. This was 1860, and Gordon was sent out with the rank of captain. The first work of this expeditionary force was scarcely worthy of a civilized country. They set fire to a summer palace and gardens of a prince who had mistreated some English prisoners. It was a piece of vandalism that went against the grain with Gordon. "You can scarcely imagine the beauty and the magnificence of the palaces we burnt," he writes. "It made one's heart sore to destroy them. It was wretchedly demoralizing work." In the spring of 1862, Gordon had become a major, and was ordered, with a Lieutenant Carden, to explore the Great Wall of China. This was more to his liking. The two men were congenial, and well fitted by temperament and experience for the task. They penetrated provinces in the interior never before entered by a white man, and had a variety of adventures, some amusing, others exciting. During the winter it grew extremely cold high up in the mountains. He relates that eggs were frozen as hard as if they had been boiled. At another time they are caught in a terrific dust storm, which he thus describes: "The sky was as dark as night. Huge columns of dust came sweeping down, and it blew a regular hurricane, the blue sky appearing now and then through the breaks. The quantity of dust was indescribable. A canal, about 50 miles long and 18 feet wide and 7 deep, was completely filled up." From these more or less peaceful incidents, Gordon was presently called to more exciting events. The great Taiping rebellion had been raging for some months. It was the work of a Chinese schoolmaster, who said that heaven had sent him to rescue China. He chose for title the Heavenly King, and with some thousands of fanatical followers overran a large part of the interior. His seat of government was in Nanking. In his first clashes with the small British army in 1862, his troops had the better of the argument. They spoke with open contempt of the foreigners, and all English, whether soldiers or missionaries, were in imminent danger. Things came to such a pass that an American named Ward obtained permission to organize a band of volunteers for mutual protection. This band did remarkable work, and soon grew from a force of 200 to 2,000, every man of them ready to die in his tracks. They met the fanatical followers of the Heavenly King more than halfway, and gave them such thorough doses of hot shot and cold steel that the rebels finally ran at sight of them. It is said that Ward's men fought 70 engagements in 1 year, and won every fight. The Imperial Chinese government was very grateful for their aid, and conferred upon them a high-sounding name which meant Ever Victorious Army. Unluckily, Ward lost his life in leading an assault, and left his army without a general. Li Hung Chang, the statesman, who was later known as the Grand Old Man of China, came to the British commander, General Staveley, and asked him to appoint a British officer to lead the ever victorious army. Staveley cast about him, and his eye fell upon Major Gordon, who was then engaged upon a survey of the defenses of Shanghai. He had known Gordon and admired him. He believed that here was the man for the task. "What he was before Sebastopol, he has been since, faithful, trusty, and successful," reasoned the general. "Before Peking and Shanghai, he was evinced just the qualities that are needed now. Although he has never been in command, he will rise to this occasion, to which he is more fitted than any other man I know." Gordon at first declined the honor, perhaps through false modesty, and the command was given to Captain Holland, with bad results. Holland traded too much on the invincibility of the ever victorious army, and attacked a strongly fortified position at Tatsan. His forces were driven off with a loss of 300 men. It was a grievous loss, but the moral loss was far deeper. His men lost spirit, while the rebels were extravagant in their glee. Something had to be done at once. Again they came to Gordon with the offer of leadership, and this time he accepted, but not without some misgiving. In a letter home dated March 24th, 1863, he writes: "I am afraid you will be much vexed at my having taken the command of the Sung Kang force, and that I am now a mandarin. I have taken the step on consideration. I think that anyone who contributes to putting down this rebellion fulfills a humane task, and I also think tends a great deal to open China to civilization." Gordon soon proved that he had both courage and resourcefulness. He did not risk another assault upon Tatsan, as the rebels expected, but decided to attack them in another quarter. He took 1,000 men by river to an inland town, Chengzu. Here was a loyal Chinese garrison which had been besieged by the rebels and was in sore straits. The coming of Gordon was a bold and unexpected move, as the rebels must have outnumbered his force 5 to 1. But Gordon had brought 2 field pieces along, and at once opened fire. By nightfall the enemy had enough of it, and retreated. The next morning the ever victorious army marched triumphantly into Chengzu, where they received a great welcome. Gordon thus received reinforcements not only from this garrison, but also from some of the rebel forces who had begun to smell a mouse, and decided to come over while the coming was good. Gordon was much interested in some of these young rebel chiefs. He says that they were very intelligent, and were splendidly dressed in their silks, and had big pearls in their caps. The head man was about 35 years old, and was ill and worn with anxiety. "He was so very glad to see me,
and chin-chinned most violently, regretting his inability to give me a present, which I told him was not the custom of our people.
This rapid victory was productive of several good results. It once more put the rebels on the run. It restored the morale of his troops and gave them confidence in their new leader, and it brought him many recruits. One especially gratifying result was that several British officers asked leave to serve under him. Gordon had made a firm friend of Li Hung Chang, who aided him in every possible way. He introduced much needed discipline into his troops, who had been at first mere adventurers, and also established regular grades of pay. The Chinese government was glad to assume these payments, while the English authorities were well content with the unique arrangement. Whether or not Gordon would have called it anomalous, it was working, and that was the main thing. Gordon saw to it that his men were well armed, well paid, well dressed, and well fed. Always he had the horrible example of the Crimean campaign before his eyes, and he was resolved that never again, if he could help it, should such conditions recur. He was thus one of the first of our generals to meet the need of a modern army in a modern way. As he wrote at the destruction of Sebastopol, "The old army is dead." After Gordon had got his new army in readiness, and not until then, he launched his systematic campaign against the rebels. First he moved against Quinsan, an important stronghold. It was a large city, some 4 or 5 miles in circumference, and clustered about a commanding hill. This city and its approaches were held by a force of about 12,000. Against them Gordon brought a force of 2,000 infantry and 600 artillery. On the east side of the city there was a considerable body of water, Lake Yangsing, and on the other side of the lake the village of Suchow, also occupied by the rebels. Gordon brought up his fleet of small ships and one steamboat on which he had placed guns, and, running in between the two towns, cut the enemy in two, throwing them into such confusion that both towns were soon taken by assault. Gordon wrote home an amusing account of this battle. It seems that the rebels inland were unused to steamboats, and when this vessel charged up with whistle going, they thought it some sort of wrathful god or demon.
"The horror of the rebels at the steamer is very great. When she whistles, they cannot make it out," he says,
and adds that because of this victory he has been given the rank of Tsung Ping, or Red Button Mandarin, about equivalent to brigadier general. These engagements were but the forerunner of many similar ones. His army took town after town until order was once more restored, and
broke the back of the rebellion.
The grateful Chinese government showered him with titles. He was made a Titu, which gave him the highest rank in the Chinese army. The emperor himself commanded that he should be awarded with a yellow riding jacket to be worn on his person, and a peacock's feather to be carried on his cap. Also, that there be bestowed on him 4 suits of the uniform proper to his rank of Titu, in token of our favor and desire to do him honor. It must not be inferred that Gordon came into his high honors in China easily. He was constantly beset by difficulties. His own men on more than one occasion tried to start a mutiny, and it was only by a display of his highest and sternest qualities of leadership that he restored order. The Chinese officials also had to be handled with diplomacy. They were accustomed to bargaining, and could not believe at first that Gordon was not working for selfish ends. It was only when they realized the true character of the man that their esteem and affection were fully enlisted. The emperor wished to bestow on him a large sum of money, and this was refused. The Chinese were nonplussed. Prince Kung reported to a British officer as follows:
"We do not know what to do. He will not receive money from us, and we have already given him every honor which it is in the power of the emperor to bestow. But as these can be of little value in his eyes, I have brought you this letter, and ask you to give it to the Queen of England, that she may bestow on him some reward which would be more valuable in his eyes."
The love of this strange race of people for a foreign officer was not idly bestowed. They were the first to recognize his highest qualities, and though he later won high rank under the Union Jack, it is as Chinese Gordon that his name will most frequently appear in history. A fellow campaigner in China writes:
"What is perhaps most striking in Gordon's career in China is the entire devotion with which the native soldiers served him, and the implicit faith they had in the result of operations in which he was personally present. In their eyes, General Gordon was literally a magician to whom all things were possible. They believed him to bear a charmed life, and a short stick or rattan cane which he inevitably carried about, and with which he always pointed in direction the fire of artillery or other operations, was firmly looked on as a wand or talisman. These notions, especially the men's idea that their general had a charmed existence, were substantially aided by Gordon's constant habit, when the troops were under fire, of appearing suddenly, usually unattended, and calmly standing in the very hottest part of the fire."
As to Gordon's personal appearance, a pen picture by comrade in arms Colonel Butler deserves place.
In figure, Gordon, at 40 years of age, stood somewhat under middle height, slight but strong, active and muscular. A profusion of thick brown hair clustered above a broad open forehead. His features were regular, his mouth firm, and his expression, when silent, had a certain undertone of sadness, which instantly vanished when he spoke. But it was the clear blue-gray eye and the low, soft, and very distinctive voice that left the most lasting impression on the memory of the man who had seen and spoken with Charles Gordon. An eye that seemed to have looked at great distances, and seen the load of life carried on many shoulders, and a voice that, like the clear chime of some Flemish belfry, had in it fresh music to welcome the newest hour, even though it had rung out the note of many a vanished day.
Important dates in Gordon's life: 1833, January 28th, Charles George Gordon, born. 1849, entered Royal Military Academy, Woolwich. 1852, commissioned second lieutenant of engineers. 1854, sent to the Crimea to construct huts and trenches. 1862, sent as major to explore Great Wall of China. 1863, took command of ever victorious army in China. 1864, crushed native rebellion and given highest rank in Chinese army. 1874, sent on first expedition to Egypt and the Sudan as colonel. 1881, made major general. 1884, sent in command of expedition to the Sudan. 1885, January 24th, lost his life in the massacre at Khartoum. End of Gordon, Part 12. This recording by hearhis.com.
Section 13 of Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Shiromi Arserio. Boy's Book of Famous Soldiers by J. Walker McSpadden. Roberts, Part 1. Roberts, the weak boy with the strong will. When one is picking out soldiers, one usually chooses big men. You see a strapping fellow going by in regimentals and you say, "My, what a dandy soldier." Well, there have been some big men in stature who have been big soldiers, such as Washington, but it is interesting to note that many of our great generals have been undersized. Such were Grant, Wellington, and Napoleon. Such was Lord Roberts, who became Earl and Marshal, and was one of the best-loved leaders that England has produced. He was associated with two great campaigns to extend the British Empire, in India and South Africa, and passed away in the midst of the Great World War, within a few months of Kitchener. And yet, as a boy, no one would have picked him out as destined to become a famous soldier. One recent biographer, Wheeler, calls him a weak boy with a strong will, and we cannot do better than repeat this as giving some sort of key to his career. Roberts himself has left an entertaining story of his life in 41 years in India, which shows that a soldier's life is not tinsel and parade, but is made up of infinite hardship. The weak boy must indeed have to have a strong will in order to pull through. Frederick Roberts was born in India at a time when his father, Abraham Roberts, was lieutenant colonel of infantry at Cawnpore. This fine old soldier gave a lifetime of service to the crown, and was active in the border raids in India. His son lived to complete the task which he began, of helping to open India to the civilized world. For his services, Abraham Roberts became a general and was knighted. The son, who was destined to win still higher honors, began his career September 30th, 1832. Although the boy was born amid the smell of gunpowder, he must have been a disappointment to his soldier father. He was puny and sickly, and for a time it did not seem likely that he would live at all. So when he was only a few months old, he was taken from the uncongenial air of India and brought by his parents to England. Here he spent his boyhood away from the father and mother who were forced by official duties to return to the East. His home was a charming country house at Clifton near Bristol, where for the first years he had private tutors. One interesting experience was in a small school at Carrickmacross in Ireland. Then, at 11, he attended public school at Hampton. But almost nothing is set down in detail as to these early years, which would show that besides being a weakling, he was in no sense remarkable. He was merely another of those small, backward urchins that one may see at any recess, on any public school playground. Still, his father was set upon his receiving a military education. "It will do no harm, anyway, and may straighten his shoulders a bit," he doubtless said. And so at 13, young Roberts was entered at Eton, that training ground of so many of England's soldiers. He made his first mark in this famous school by winning a prize in mathematics. The obscure lad was beginning to assert himself. To the end of his days, Robert held a warm regard for Eton. Once, when at the end of a great campaign, he was presented with a sword of honor on this boyhood's drill ground, he said to a younger generation then assembled, "To you boys who intend to enter the army, the study and sports of this place are your best training. England's greatest general, himself an Etonian, is reported to have said the Battle of Waterloo was won in the Eton playing fields. In thus expressing himself, the Duke, Wellington, meant that bodily vigor, power of endurance, courage and rapidity of decision are produced by the manly games which are fostered here." Undoubtedly there was a personal touch to these remarks, as Roberts recalled how he himself had begun to gain these sterling qualities on the cricket field and gridiron. When 15, he entered the military college at Sandhurst, but remained there only 2 terms. By nature he was a studious chap, doing especially well in German and mathematics. So easily did he solve problems in algebra and geometry that his mates promptly nicknamed him Deductions. Leaving Sandhurst, he put in a few months at a preparatory military school at Wimbledon, but his father's return to England in 1849 marked the first definite step in his plans. Colonel Roberts, after several years away from his son, was delighted to see that the thin chest was indeed filling out, and the shoulders throwing back. "Do you think you can stand India now, my lad?" he asked. "Why not, sir?" replied the boy, briefly. "Then I think that the East India Company's service is the place for you." Colonel Roberts himself had been connected with this great company, which was the forerunner of the government in India, and he was right in thinking that its service offered many chances of advancement. Accordingly, the boy was entered in the company's own military school at Addiscombe, and in less than 2 years had become a second lieutenant in the Bengal Artillery, a military company maintained as part of this huge commercial enterprise. In 1852, in his 20th year, he received his first marching orders. They were to report for duty. He set sail by way of Suez, but there was no canal in those days to make possible an all-water journey. Instead, at Alexandria, he changed to a small inland steamer, going by canal and river to Cairo. Thence a hot, dusky trek across the desert was necessary in order to reach Suez. Once in Calcutta, the young subaltern lost no time in proving that he was not a mollycoddle. He began by riding every horse in the battery, or troop, as it was called in those days. Thus, he tells us, I learned to understand the amount of nerve, patience, and skill necessary to the making of a good horse artillery driver, with the additional advantage that I was brought into constant contact with the men. Roberts was early learning the secret of more than one great general's success, to know his men. In later life he could call many a man by name, and knew just what each could do, while they responded with a close affection and the nickname by which he will be known to history, Bobs. It is said that Napoleon expected his officers to know the names and personal histories of every man in their command. As another result of Roberts' fellowship with the rank and file, he became a crack shot and expert horseman. During the fighting in the mutiny of Indian sepoys, he proved himself a good swordsman as well. And even when he became commander-in-chief, he would ride with a tent-pegging team of his own staff. It was a long and thorough service that he was destined to receive. He joined the Quartermaster General's office before the mutiny broke out, and remained in it for more than 20 years. During this period, he gradually worked his way up from one post of responsibility to another, doing it so gradually that even he himself hardly noticed the advance. On one occasion, for example, he superintended all the arrangements for embarking the Bengal Division, which sailed from Calcutta to take part in an expedition against Abyssinia. But how he must have chafed at the long delay in getting into the field. He asked his father more than once to get him transferred to Burma, where war had broken out, and there was a chance for active service. The transfer was not granted. The only thing that came to break up the humdrum of those first years was a cyclone. It was actually welcomed, anything for a change. Roberts gives a detailed account of it in his autobiography. He and a native servant were caught out in the open when the storm descended with little warning. I shouted to him, the servant, as loudly as I could, he relates. But the uproar was so terrific that he could not hear a word, and there was nothing for it but to try and make my own way home. The darkness was profound. As I was walking carefully along, I suddenly came in contact with an object, which a timely flash of lightning showed me was a column, standing in exactly the opposite direction from my own house. I could now locate myself correctly, and the lightning became every moment more vivid. I was enabled to grope my way by slow degrees to the mess, where I expected to find someone to show me my way home. But the servants, who knew from experience the probable effects of a cyclone, had already closed the outside Venetian shutters and barred all the doors. In vain I banged at the door and called at the top of my voice. They heard nothing. In desperation he had to make his way as best he could back to his own bungalow, about half a mile away, only to find that also barred against him. I had to continue hammering for a long time before they heard and admitted me, thankful to be comparatively safe inside a house. Another disappointment to Roberts lay in the fact that he was still away from his father, who seemed destined all his life to remain a stranger to him. The junior officer was stationed at Dum Dum, famous as the birthplace of the soft-nosed bullets, now prescribed in civilized warfare. His father had been appointed to the command of the troops at Peshawar, and now wrote him a welcome note bidding him come to join him. This was easier said than done, but was finally accomplished after 3 months of toilsome and dangerous travel. He used every sort of native conveyance: barge, post-chaise, palanquin, pony, and shank mares. But it was interesting and full of novelty to the barracks-bound soldier. He went by way of Benares, Allahabad, Cawnpore, and Meerut, places destined to win unpleasant fame in the mutiny. Peshawar, his destination, proved no less fascinating than the way stations. It commanded the caravan route between India and Afghanistan, and guarded the entrance to Khyber Pass. Lord Dalhousie described it as the outpost of the Indian Empire, a very accurate title. At Peshawar at last, Frederick Roberts became acquainted with his father, who proved a good comrade. The junior officer served as aide-de-camp on the general's staff, and went with him on several expeditions, outwardly peaceful, but inwardly full of danger. India then was a seething cauldron of trouble. Nevertheless, this period with his father is described by Frederick Roberts as one of the brightest and happiest of my early life. Unfortunately, the senior officer's health showed signs of breaking, and again father and son had to part. General Roberts resigned his command and returned to England at the end of the year 1853. Peshawar was a notoriously unhealthy station, and young Roberts also soon began to feel the effects of the climate. He was still far from robust and traded continually on his will and nerve. The native fever sapped his energy, and he was sent to recuperate to Kashmir. He was enthusiastic about the scenery here, and his tramping and shooting trips in the bracing climate soon gave back his strength and vim. It was about this time that he realized his pet ambition of joining the horse artillery. He also set himself with a will to the study of Hindustani, as he realized that his usefulness in the quartermaster general's office would be vastly increased if he could deal directly with the natives. This was a turning point in Robert's career. It was to be his first stepping stone upward, and it illustrates the point that even though opportunity may knock at the door, one must be ready for her. That Roberts finally won his largest success was due not so much to his genius as to his industry. Edison says that genius is made up of 2% inspiration and 98% perspiration. End of Roberts Part 13. Recording by Shiromi Osorio. Shiromi.net